Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I couldn't tell how long I'd been trapped in my scorched prison. Weeks, months, perhaps years. Time had no meaning here. 3 years before my death, I had committed a terrible crime, and now I was suffering a fitting punishment orchestrated by the mysterious entity who ruled this infernal domain. I had endured their twisted examination, but the verdict remained uncertain. So I'd been confined here to a charred nightclub, the blackened shell of my former business, left to wither while they contemplated my fate. I had tried everything imaginable to escape this hell, kicking at the collapsed doorways until my legs ached, attempting to tear through the burned stage curtains, and trying to dismantle the bar counter with my bare hands. I worked frantically for what felt like hours until my hands were raw and bleeding. But when I blinked, everything returned to its previous state. I tried to end it all several times, smashing my head against the melted sound system as I attempted to crack my skull open. But no matter how severely I injured myself, the same thing happened every time. I could not die, and whenever I regained consciousness, all my injuries had mysteriously healed. They say hell is other people, but for me, it was the monotony and isolation. Eventually, I abandoned all attempts at suicide or escape, and all I had left were my thoughts. I don't know how long it took for my sanity to slip away. I would stare at the ash-covered floor for hours or even days, and I began to see things, hideous creatures crawling through the debris, staring at me from the darkness with hungry eyes, eagerly awaiting any chance to devour my flesh. Sometimes I would have gladly allowed these monsters to finish me, but the invisible barrier between us was impenetrable. Other times I swore I glimpsed something in the cracked mirror behind the bar, jumping at the sight of a ghostly face reflected back. Sometimes it was my ex-girlfriend Elena, other times my victim Victor, and occasionally I saw the dark-suited entity who had banished me here, a being with eyes like swirling black holes that terrified me more than any other horror. Was I going mad, or were the otherworldly forces simply toying with me? I couldn't tell, and ultimately I barely cared. All I wanted was for this hell to end. But as time passed, I began to lose hope, fearing they had forgotten about me, condemned to remain here for eternity. So you can imagine my shock when, in the blink of an eye, I was transported elsewhere. My heart raced as I looked around and saw the barren landscape before me. I was no longer in the burned-out club, but standing on a deserted highway, surrounded by an endless wasteland, with the only light coming from the moon hanging low in the night sky. I panicked, afraid I would collapse from exhaustion in this inhospitable environment. But when I tried to sit down, I found I couldn't control my movements. My body began walking forward of its own accord. I had no control. I was merely a passenger. Taking a deep breath, I surrendered to the invisible force guiding me, realizing I was entirely helpless and at the whim of whatever hellish entity held me in its grasp. I walked for what seemed like miles, the road cutting straight through the barren desert. I tried to focus on the path ahead, fearing what might lurk in the darkness beyond. But occasionally, I couldn't help but glance into the vast emptiness. When I did, I swore I could see shadows moving across the sand. Unidentified creatures with glowing amber eyes that watched me closely as I progressed through their desolate realm. The road reminded me of the line, the queue of damned souls trapped between the light and the vortex. If that had been my first test, was this my second? If not, what was the purpose of it? I soon received an answer. Of sorts. As I continued walking, I came face to face with a horrific scene. In the distance, I saw my nightclub, Pulse, perfectly intact as if the fire had never happened. This wasn't merely a similar building, but an exact replica, right down to the neon sign with one flickering letter, and the poster for that night's event. My heart pounded as my feet carried me closer, and my eyes fell upon two darkened figures at the rear entrance. One was my doppelganger, an exact copy of myself, at first glance at least. The other was Victor, the club's star DJ. I was witnessing my worst moment. The night I deliberately sabotaged the electrical system while Victor was performing, causing the fire that killed him and 16 others, all because I was jealous of his rising fame and the attention Elena gave him. I continued watching the ghastly reenactment as my body walked past the scene. My doppelganger and the copy of Victor ignored me until the last second, when they looked up and met my gaze, their eyes completely void, black abysses that seemed to pull at my very soul. I turned away in horrified disgust, focusing on the path ahead as my body kept moving forward. I couldn't look back, but this leg of my journey was almost complete. The wasteland on my right gave way to a vast body of dark water, one which I recognized all too well. My heart sank as I feared the puppet masters would send me to the water's depths. But that wasn't what happened. I spotted an old railway station by the shore, with a dim light flickering from within the decaying structure. Suddenly, my body stopped moving about 30 yards from the station. I heard a click in my head and was astonished to realize I had regained control of my limbs. I couldn't quite believe they had released me from their control, and part of me suspected a trick. I wanted time to consider my next move, but the situation quickly deteriorated. I detected movement from the corner of my eye, turning my head in time to see a large humanoid creature launching itself from behind a dune, unfurling massive leathery wings as it shrieked and took flight. The shadowy monster disappeared from my line of sight for a moment, but then I heard a heavy thud behind me as the creature landed. I screamed as the winged beast screeched in excitement and began advancing toward me. The creature had a human-like face distorted with rage, its mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. The monster was powerful and fast. I knew it wouldn't hesitate to tear me apart, and I only had one chance. I sprinted forward with a shaking body, running for my life. I shouldn't have looked back over my shoulder, but couldn't help myself. The beast had an impressive wingspan, a twisted human face, and eyes that burned like embers. It paused for a moment, perhaps surprised by my sudden movement. But the beast soon overcame its hesitation, wailing like a banshee as it shot me a murderous glare, spread its wings, and took off. I kept running, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. There was only one place to go, the railway station. I didn't think I'd make it, but somehow I covered the distance while the screeching beast raced toward me. I saw the door of the station hanging open and made straight for it, leaping the last few yards as the creature descended, its claws only inches from my back. I landed heavily on the wooden floor, scrambling up and slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't expect this to stop the beast, but to my astonishment, I watched through the cracked window as the wailing creature withdrew, flapping its wings as it retreated back toward the dunes. Breathing a deep sigh of relief, I turned around to face a fresh horror as I surveyed my surroundings. The interior of the railway station had been transformed into a rundown music lounge, complete with vinyl records lining the walls and the stench of stale smoke and something far fouler. It was dark and dilapidated inside the lounge, nothing like the upscale club I had once owned. Nevertheless, the unpleasant interior didn't concern me as much as the terrifying and familiar figure standing behind the turntables. I stood frozen in awestruck horror as I observed the demonic entity casually adjusting dials and switches behind a crimson-colored mixer. He looked up when he saw me, his impossible, vortex-like eyes placing me in a trance as I found myself under his dark spell. He formed his lips into something resembling a smile, although it certainly didn't put me at ease. And then he spoke in a deep, almost melodic voice. "Ah, Nathan, I'm so glad you could make it. You must be thirsty after your journey. Let me offer you a drink." On the house, of course. I was puzzled by the keeper's words and unconvinced by his supposedly friendly welcome. The last time I'd spoken with this entity, he'd confined me to my charred prison, warning that a far worse fate could await me. Naturally, I was terrified and wanted nothing to do with him. I certainly didn't want to accept a drink from this being. Nevertheless, I was now entirely under the keeper's control, and before I knew it, I was slowly walking toward the bar, my feet moving even though my brain was screaming, "Stop." I reached the counter, but didn't dare to look into the keeper's swirling, mesmerizing eyes. I kept my head down, focusing on his immaculate suit and tie, watching his bony hands as he grabbed 2 glasses and an unlabeled bottle from underneath the counter. "Vodka neat. That's your preference, isn't it?" he asked. I opened my trembling lips, struggling to speak. I don't." But he didn't give me the chance to finish as he carefully poured 2 glasses of clear liquid and pushed them across the counter toward me. "Here you go, Nathan. 1 drink for you and the same for your friend over there." His bony finger pointed to the corner of the room, and I turned to face the figure sitting alone in a darkened booth, his head raised as he stared back at me. My heart beat frantically in my chest and my body trembled, but I can't say I was surprised. The intense eyes glaring toward me belonged to Victor, the man I'd killed 3 years ago out of jealousy and spite. The last time I saw him, Victor was being dragged into the Shadowlands by a swarm of those winged creatures. I was certain they would rip him to shreds, yet here he was, sitting in the lounge and apparently waiting for me. I hesitated for a long moment as we locked eyes. I didn't want to approach Victor, but I couldn't run away from this. I'd done this man a terrible wrong, and now I needed to make amends, or at least attempt to do so. I took a deep breath, putting my head down as I walked across the floor, my hands shaking as I struggled to hold the 2 glasses. As I got closer, I could see Victor's scarred face, his arms still covered in burn marks as they had been the last time I saw him. when Victor previously confronted me in the line. He'd attempted to strangle me in a fit of rage. I wondered whether he still desired revenge. I couldn't blame him if he did, but there was no way to predict the man's intentions from his cold, emotionless eyes. I stood over the table for a long moment, meeting his gaze and resisting the urge to recoil from his gruesome injuries. The tension was almost unbearable, and I found myself unable to speak. In the end, it was Victor who broke the silence, saying, "Sit down, Nathan." He pointed to the chair on the opposite side of the table. I hesitated for only a second before sitting down and placing the two glasses between us. Victor nodded his head before using his burned right hand to awkwardly pick up his glass and hold it aloft. "How about having a drink with me, Nathan?" My jaw dropped as I looked down at the glass before me, feeling sick as I smelled the strong liquor. I glanced up at Victor's intense eyes, shaking my head vigorously as I stammered my response. I don't drink anymore, Victor. I gave up after." "What?" Victor interjected impatiently. "You gave up alcohol after burning down your club and killing me." "Well, that hardly matters now, does it?" I broke eye contact, struggling to control my emotions as I continued staring at the glass. "I can't," was my pathetic reply. "I'm afraid I must insist, Nathan," answered Victor, his tone suddenly turning hostile. I looked up and saw his scarred face contorted with anger. I knew from previous experience how quickly Victor could lose his temper. So I submitted to his wishes, grasping my glass with a shaking hand and raising it to meet that of my unlikely companion. "Cheers," Victor exclaimed more amicably as he clinked his glass against mine. I watched as he downed his drink in one, pouring it down his throat. I paused for a second before following suit, coughing as the harsh liquor burned its way down. But then something extraordinary occurred. I felt a surge of energy flowing through my veins, a burst of clarity that cut through my dread and gave me renewed confidence and hope. And then I looked across the table and saw Victor transformed. He was no longer scarred and burned. Instead, Victor was restored to his former self, the young, vibrant DJ he'd been before the fire and his untimely death. I was astonished and once again left speechless, but Victor simply smiled and nodded as he said, "I think it's high time we had a proper conversation, don't you, Nathan?" I nodded vigorously as tears welled up in my eyes. "I really am so sorry, Victor," I whimpered emotionally. I knew how inadequate my apology was, but Victor's reaction surprised me. "I know you're sorry, Nathan, but we're past that now." He sighed deeply, staring at his empty glass before continuing, "I'm guessing you have many questions, and you won't get any answers from him." He nodded over to the keeper, who continued to adjust knobs on the turntables, apparently disinterested in our conversation. "You know what's happening here, Victor?" I asked, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu. "I believe I have the answers you need," he answered cryptically. He let that statement hang in the air. Meanwhile, my mind raced with questions. I had so many it was difficult to know where to start. So I returned to the events of our last meeting. "I saw you die," I muttered nervously. "The winged creatures took you." Victor shot me a knowing half-smile before replying. "I was already dead, remember. Those creatures can hurt us. They can tear you apart, but you always come back. You pass out from the pain, and when you regain consciousness, you're right back where you started. That's the true hell, Nathan, to know there's no peace, no final release from the pain and fear. He broke eye contact, looking down at his empty glass as if wishing it would refill itself. His words chilled me, but I reckoned Victor must be telling the truth. Still, there was so much I didn't understand. "The line," I said firmly. "I thought it was about salvation, about who reaches paradise and who gets dragged to hell. But it wasn't that simple, was it?" Victor raised his head, appearing thoughtful for a moment as he looked over at the turntables. There was a lengthy pause before he eventually replied. "It wasn't about salvation, but redemption. The purpose was to test us, to see how we'd react when pushed to our limits." He turned to face me, intensity in his eyes as he spoke seriously. "You need to understand something, Nathan. The three of us are connected. Ever since you caused that fire, our fates have been intertwined. We three were tested in the line, and we all fell short." I shook my head in confusion. Perhaps I'm not the brightest, but none of this made sense to me. "I can understand why Elena and I were punished," I exclaimed. "But why you, Victor? You were the victim." "True," Victor answered with a nod, "but my test was forgiveness, and I failed completely. I let hatred and a desire for revenge poison my soul, and for that I'm sorry." I looked into his eyes with astonishment, not believing what I'd just heard. Victor was apologizing for not forgiving me. I thought he had every right to bear a grudge, but I guess that's not how it works in the afterlife. Still, I clearly wasn't the good guy in this story, and I had wronged Victor. Repeatedly. "I failed in the line," I admitted. "I should have made amends, but instead I threw you to those creatures." Victor sighed deeply before replying, swallowing an old bitterness that he was trying hard to put behind him. "Yes, you failed on that score, but you did what was necessary to save Elena. You sacrificed yourself for her. That's the only reason you're not in hell right now." An ice-cold chill ran through me as I realized how close I'd come to eternal damnation. But this left me with an obvious question. "What about Elena?" I asked sheepishly. "Where is she?" Victor nodded ominously, like he'd been anticipating this very question. "Elena is in a bad place right now, but she's not beyond redemption. We can help her. Correction, we must help her." I thought Victor was joking, but when I looked him in the eye, I saw he was deadly serious. But why would Victor want to help Elena? She was my ex-girlfriend, the woman I'd once loved with all my heart. But my feelings toward her now were complicated. I didn't like the idea of her suffering, but couldn't forget how she'd behaved in the line, playing us both to save herself. I thought about concealing this fact from Victor, but there'd been too many lies already. "You know, she manipulated us both," I muttered. "She lied to you, Victor." He didn't seem surprised by this revelation, and his reply confused me even further. "Elena lied about some things, but not about everything," he replied. "What do you mean?" I asked in puzzlement. Victor frowned like he didn't understand my question. "You don't remember how you died?" he inquired cautiously. My brain ached as I desperately tried to recall. I'd spent so long inside that burned club, trying to remember the details of my death. There were fleeting memories, but nothing concrete. As hard as I tried, I couldn't fill in the gaps. "I remember being in my apartment," was my eventual and uncertain reply. "I think I was drinking." Victor looked visibly sad in that moment, as if he genuinely felt sympathy for me. You weren't just drinking, he confirmed. But don't worry about that now. We've got to go. Go where? I asked as my frustration grew. To get Elena, Victor replied firmly. She needs our help. And I promise you, Nathan, you'll find the answers you seek on our journey. Suddenly, Victor stood up and started walking toward the exit, briefly turning his head to look at me before he proceeded. I continued to sit, confused and uncertain, but realizing Victor wanted me to follow him. I was frightened by what lay ahead, yet I didn't want to stay here in limbo. I cast a glance toward the keeper, avoiding his swirling eyes. I didn't know whether I could trust Victor, but I certainly didn't want to stay here with the keeper. And so I stood up on shaking legs and cautiously followed in Victor's footsteps. I deliberately avoided the keeper's gaze as I walked, but noted how he casually returned to adjusting the turntables, while seemingly ignoring us both. But as Victor and I passed him, he called out amicably, saying, "Good luck, gentlemen." Victor made for the back exit, placing his fingers on the door handle before turning to face me, his expression still serious as he delivered a stern warning. "Just remember one thing, Nathan. We have a specific mission, and we can't get distracted. We are both tied to Elena, and she's the one we're going to save. We will encounter other lost souls during our journey, just like we did in the line. But we can't save them. They're all fighting their own battles, and will find their own way in the end. Understand?" I nodded, even though I didn't fully comprehend the rules. I didn't know what lay ahead, but had little choice but to follow Victor's lead. We exited through the metal door, and were instantly hit by a stifling heat and heavy rain that fell upon our heads. It was still night, but the vast body of water before us was dimly illuminated by the pale moonlight. What drew my attention was the substantial island which sat to our north, upon which stood a towering lighthouse with high stone walls and a beacon easily 100 feet in height. I stared at that distant tower for a long moment, focusing on the rotating light at its top. I can't quite describe my feelings as I looked upon that burning beacon. I'd been in many difficult situations and witnessed many horrors, but I sensed there was an absolute evil inside that lighthouse, a monstrosity beyond my meager imagination. And it was watching us. I don't know how I knew this, but somehow I did. This dark entity was closely monitoring our progress through its realm, and it surely didn't welcome our presence here. I stood frozen under the biting rain, unable to divert my gaze from the ominous tower. I was conscious of an approaching storm, with distant thunder and flashes of lightning assaulting my senses. All my instincts told me to turn and run, but Victor gave me strength, grabbing my arm firmly and forcing me to look him in the eye. "We need to get to the island," he said firmly. "We've got to do this. For Elena, I repeated uncertainly, as I looked away from the horizon and followed my unlikely ally down the slope leading to the shore. I saw a dock leading out into the dark water. It appeared all too familiar, but I tried not to dwell on this. At the end of the pier was a small motorboat piloted by a dark figure clad in black rainwear, their face hidden by a hood that covered their head. Victor walked down the dock and toward the waiting boat, but naturally I hesitated, glaring suspiciously at the hooded figure. Victor turned to face me, visibly sighing as he noted my hesitation. "Come on," he exclaimed, raising his voice to be heard over the downpour. This is the only way to cross the water. I took a deep breath before proceeding. We took our places aboard the small boat, and I tried my hardest not to look at the hooded pilot as we cast off. I dreaded to imagine what was hidden underneath that hood. I don't know how the boat's engine worked in this realm. There was no sound, yet we moved steadily across the dark lake, slowly getting closer to the island. The water's surface was bombarded by raindrops, but otherwise still, at least at first. I looked down at the dark water and saw the first ripples. As yet unidentified creatures began to rise from the depths. I gasped when I saw the first of them, a charred corpse, somehow still moving despite its burned and blackened flesh. The zombie-like creature reeked of smoke and burning, its vacant eyes full of rage and hunger as it focused on our boat and furiously swam toward us. I feared what it would do to us, but a moment later, a second corpse broke through the surface, promptly attacking the first. Soon, the two were tearing at each other with their bare hands, roaring like wild animals and slowly dismembering each other, until the remains sank beneath the surface. This scene was soon replicated across the lake and on all sides of our boat, as dozens of moaning, burned victims emerged and violently fought against each other, ripping bodies apart and filling the lake with ash and cinders. A few managed to fight their way through the scrum, desperately approaching our boat with their arms outstretched. But our hooded pilot soon drove them off, hissing like a snake and scaring the dead, forcing them back underneath the water. After a while, I no longer feared these lost souls. Instead, I pitied them. But I remembered Victor's words. We couldn't help these people and had to focus on our mission. Thankfully, we soon navigated through the lake of the dead, although our situation certainly didn't improve once we reached the island. The pilot would not land directly on the shore, so we were forced to wade through the shallows to reach the beach. I didn't look back as the boat left us behind. We climbed the steep, rocky slope from the beach, reaching the top where we witnessed the imposing lighthouse in all its terrible glory. The high stone walls surrounded a courtyard, with a narrow path allowing access. The heavy gate lay open, but the lighthouse was far from undefended. I looked up to the top of the walls, horrified to see winged monsters perched on the edges, glaring down at us with murderous intent in their glowing eyes. I recognized the beasts, noting their resemblance to the creature who'd attacked me in the desert. Except now there were many, 13 by my quick count, all watching us closely as we advanced toward the entrance. As always, I followed Victor's lead, but I sensed that he too was afraid, noting how his body trembled as he avoided looking at the bat-like creatures. We reached the gate and began walking through, our footsteps echoing on the stone path as we struggled not to slip on the rain-soaked surface. I made the mistake of looking down over the edge of the narrow path. In the dark waters below, I saw snapping creatures, trapped predators who surely sensed our presence, no doubt hoping Victor and I would fall so they could feast upon our flesh. But the monsters in the water weren't our primary concern. We were halfway along the path when we heard a terrifying screeching from above. I fearfully glanced up in time to see several of the winged creatures taking off from the walls, extending their leathery wings as they soared down toward us, their razor-sharp claws extended, and their human-like faces twisted with predatory zeal. "Run!" Victor screamed as his composure broke. I didn't need to be told twice. as I sprinted toward the lighthouse entrance with Victor by my side. But I didn't think we'd make it. The lead creature was only a few feet above me, wailing like a banshee as it prepared to dig its claws into my back. But suddenly, I saw a projectile flying through the air, turning to watch as the arrow hit the winged monster in its chest. The creature shrieked in pain, abandoning its attack as it retreated, flying upward and back to the safety of the walls. A moment later, a second arrow was fired, striking another monster and piercing its pale flesh. Before long, all the creatures were retreating, aborting their assault under fire. I turned my head, looking back across the path to see our savior. The figure illuminated by the lighthouse beam was instantly recognizable, even though he had taken on a different form. The vortex-like eyes were a dead giveaway. It was the keeper, except now he'd traded his suit for a set of rain gear, and his turntables for a compound bow. He nodded at me as he lowered his weapon, and I nodded back in thanks, although I was very confused. For so long I'd believed this entity was my enemy, committed to punishing me for my sins. But now he'd saved us both. I looked to Victor, and I guess he read my mind because he promptly offered an explanation. He offers us protection, but it has limits. We are permitted entry to the lighthouse, but will need to work quickly. If we can't save Elena in time, all three of us will be trapped here forever. I stared at Victor in astonishment. How could he have kept this from me? What else did he know that he wasn't telling me? I was angry and scared, but also filled with determination. It's difficult to explain, but for so long my existence had been empty and without purpose. But now I had a mission, a chance at redemption. I was beginning to understand what Victor meant. I felt it deep inside, realizing that the three of us were tied together in death. We had to find Elena and bring her home. It was our only chance to avoid eternal damnation. We entered the lighthouse without further incident, the wounded creatures screeching in annoyance as they watched from the walls. Once again, Victor led the way as we negotiated a spiral staircase and advanced further up the tower. My companion knew the path, so I assumed he'd been here before. But Victor was clearly far from comfortable in this environment, his composure now gone as he frantically climbed the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. I followed in his footsteps, noting how the rain had become even heavier, to the point where it physically hurt when it hit the windows. The storm was closer now too, with the thunder near deafening and the lightning temporarily illuminating the stairwell before it returned to darkness. I occasionally glanced upward at the rotating beacon that dominated the tower, but I couldn't bear to look at it for long. I could only hope that the evil which dwelled at the top was incapable of coming down to our level. But the intensity of the storm and urgency of Victor's movements were concerning, to say the least. But before long, we emerged onto a landing and witnessed a horrifying scene. As the rain poured down through a hole in the ceiling, a line of lost souls trudged grimly around the circular chamber. Clad in soaked rags, their feet were bare and bodies emaciated. All their heads were down, and not one of the damned spoke or even acknowledged our presence in their hell. There was an obvious difference between this line and the one I'd previously experienced. All of the souls were moving constantly, albeit slowly, but they were literally going nowhere. The damned slowly walked the perimeter of the room before reaching the exit doorway, at which point They turned around and walked the other way, turning again before repeating the process. They were walking in circles and seemed to have been doing so for a long time. The waterlogged stone floor was surrounded by small alcoves with barred openings, and above, dominating the entire chamber, was the rotating beacon, home to God knows what. I shouldn't have done so, but I craned my neck upward, looking at the source of light at the top of the lighthouse. I only looked for a second, but observed a dark figure silhouetted against the beam. Its appearance was little more than a shadow, but the mere sight of this entity provoked a chilling, primal terror deep within me, a fear which paralyzed me until Victor shook me back to reality, forcing me to look away. "Don't do that," he screamed frantically, his eyes filled with something close to madness. "Don't look at it, not even for a moment." We joined the line, pushing in between two damned souls who did not object. But as we passed by the row of alcoves, we bore witness to the true horror. Inside each small cell, visible through the bars, were flame-filled torture chambers with screaming, moaning victims. I saw naked bodies engulfed in perpetual fire, their skin constantly burning and regenerating in an endless cycle of agony. And the torturers were foul demons, snarling, ember-eyed humanoids with hateful expressions and sharp claws that they gleefully used to stoke the flames, intensifying their victims' suffering without even a hint of mercy. I looked into the bloodshot eyes of the torture victims and saw nothing but pain, fear, and madness. I thought about trying to help them, but knew I couldn't. Victor had been clear on this, and so I looked away, trying in vain to ignore the screams and the awful sound of flames consuming flesh. We joined the grim procession under the leaking ceiling as the thunderstorm raged outside. We walked around in circles 5 times, my nerves frayed as I felt myself slipping toward madness. I wondered why the others continued this endless, pointless march, but then I discovered why. Suddenly, just in front of us, one of the damned collapsed, crying aloud as he dropped to his knees. "I can't take it anymore," he screamed while looking up at the ceiling. But there was no mercy in this realm. The line was held up behind him, but not for long. I saw a burst of movement in the corner of my eye, turning in time to see a demon reaching through the bars and grabbing hold of the man, digging its claws deep into his flesh. "No, please God, no," the victim screamed, but it was over quickly. The demon dragged the screaming man, pulling him through the bars and into the fiery chamber where he would surely join the other victims in eternal torment. Not a single soul in the line had attempted to save him. In fact, the damned didn't even react to his capture. They simply walked on as if nothing had happened, trudging through the puddles with their heads down. At this point, I saw this place for the hell it was. The first line I'd walked was terrifying and violent, but there was still hope in that realm. Rightly or wrongly, those trapped there believed they could escape and reach a better place. But there was no hope in this line. Here, the damned walked in circles for all eternity, without any chance of escape. They did so because the alternative was even worse. Those who fell would be dragged from the line and tortured by demons lurking inside the cells, subjected to pain and terror until madness overcame them. My heart sank, and I felt sick to my stomach. I now knew what this place was, but didn't understand what we were doing here. I put my hand on Victor's shoulder, making him turn his head as I shouted in his ear. What the hell is this? You said we were here for Elena. We are, Victor replied firmly. Just wait. I was frustrated by yet another evasive answer, but trusted Victor nonetheless. It was on our 13th circle of the chamber that a door suddenly shot open. I saw the entrance in the wall, noting how it was the only cell without bars, meaning we were unable to see whatever horrors occurred inside. I experienced a grim foreboding as we walked toward the dim light coming from the tiny room. But on some level, I knew that my destiny lay on the other side of that door. Whatever horror was inside was something I needed to face. The room we entered seemed comfortable at first. I was relieved to find sanctuary from the deluge. The smell inside was musty, but a vast improvement over the stench of burning flesh from the cells. The walls were bare, but there was a small fireplace with embers glowing in the corner, and I savored the warmth it provided. But whatever comfort I felt was short-lived, because what we saw inside that small room shook me to my very core. I spotted Victor staring blankly at the far corner of the room, and slowly turned to face in that direction. My jaw dropped when I saw the woman sitting in a rocking chair, swinging back and forth while cradling a crying baby, not a newborn, but a toddler about 1 or 1.5 years old. I recognized the young woman immediately. It was Elena, the girl I'd once loved. I called out her name, but she did not respond. It was as if she didn't even know we were there. Elena's auburn hair was tied back in a loose bun. Her face was drawn, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted, and yet her hazel eyes were full of joy and happiness as she comforted the child, singing a sweet lullaby as she gently rocked him to sleep. I looked down at the baby boy in Elena's arms, and something clicked in my brain, but I still couldn't quite put the pieces together. I was desperately trying to think, but then a heartbreaking tragedy unfolded before my eyes. In a matter of seconds, the toddler's face drained of all color. His skin turned pale and then ashen, before his tiny body crumbled into ashes, literally falling apart in Elena's arms. But the true horror was my ex-girlfriend's reaction as Elena's world ended. She cried out the child's name as she collapsed to the floor. "My kiddo, my baby boy, what have they done to you?" I saw the expression in her eyes turn from joy to devastation in an instant, and it was horrific. But what happened next was somehow even worse. In the blink of an eye, the previous scene was restored, as Mikita was brought back to life with Elena cradling him in her arms. She seemed to have no memory of the previous events, continuing to sing gently to the child, while still ignoring the presence of Victor and me. But then the tragedy played out again, with Mikita dissolving into ash while Elena cried out in anguish. It was clear she was trapped in an eternal loop. This was her torture, to see the child under her care die in her arms over and over again, until she was eventually driven mad with grief. This was Elena's hell. The terrible truth should have been obvious, but still, my brain couldn't quite connect the dots. There was a heavy roar of thunder from outside that made me jump. The storm was right on top of us now, with the damned souls barely able to stand, let alone walk under the heavy wind and rain that poured through the ceiling. I don't understand. Why is this happening? I asked, looking to Victor. My companion lost all patience at this point, grabbing me roughly by the shoulders and shaking me vigorously as he screamed in my face. "For God's sake, Nathan, we don't have time for this. Look at the child's face. Really look and you'll see the truth." I did so, focusing on the boy's deep green eyes, which were almost identical to my own. And then it finally clicked. A wave of emotions and memories came flooding back, and I remembered the painful truth. Mikita was my son. Elena had left me 3 years before. Our relationship couldn't survive the shared guilt over Victor's death. She'd moved to another city and broke off all contact. The breakup was devastating for me at the time, but I did try to move on with my life. But what I didn't know was that Elena was carrying my child, a son I would never meet. I now remembered the phone call I received from Elena's sister one stormy evening. I could tell from the tone of her voice that it was bad news. Elena was dead, killed instantly when her apartment building caught fire due to faulty wiring. She was killed instantly, as was Mikita, who was asleep in his crib. I attended the funeral, barely functioning as tears rolled down my cheeks, and I watched the 2 coffins being lowered into the ground, mother and son put to rest together. My grief was shared by Elena's parents, family, and friends, but I also felt an unbearable guilt, because I knew that Elena and Mikita would still be alive if it wasn't for the spiral of events I'd set in motion 3 years before. My life fell apart immediately after the funeral. I started drinking again in an attempt to dull the pain, but it wasn't enough. I was plagued by nightmares of the fire at my club, and of Elena and Mikita's terrifying final moments. I couldn't take it any longer. I did go back to my apartment that night, but I didn't plan to wake up again. My balcony door was open as I took a bottle of sleeping pills, washing them down with half a bottle of vodka, closing my eyes and allowing the darkness to claim me. I lost consciousness and slipped into eternal darkness, waking to find myself standing in the line, with almost no memory of the events which led to my death. I'd assumed Elena was lying when she spoke about our son, but this was only because I could not remember, as perhaps my brain had blocked out the trauma. Elena had changed some details when we met in the line, or perhaps her own memory was distorted. But now I could see her love for Mikita was genuine, and her grief at losing him was devastating. I was still trying to process this revelation when my attention was drawn outside. Suddenly, a powerful bolt of lightning struck the lighthouse directly above us. The bolt was so bright that it temporarily blinded me, and the impact shattered the stone ceiling, breaking it wide open as deep cracks emerged, quickly expanding in size as screaming souls fell inside, plummeting down into the darkness. The walls on each side of the chamber began to collapse as the huge fissures grew, coming ever closer to the room we occupied, while swallowing up everything in their path. Victor grabbed my arm so tightly that it hurt, and he screamed in my ear loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "It's now or never, Nathan. You need to get through to her. Do it now or we're all doomed." I nodded, taking a deep breath as I turned to face my ex-girlfriend. Elena was oblivious to all the chaos occurring around her, continuing to rock and sing to Mikita, even as the whole world collapsed around our heads. Elena should have been approached delicately, but there was no time for this. I grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, shaking her until she acknowledged my presence. She cried out, looking up while grasping Mikita tighter, pulling him closer to her. She took a moment to recognize me, as my sudden appearance in her world was entirely unexpected. "Nathan," she muttered weakly. "Nathan, is it really you?" I bit my lip, attempting to ignore the turmoil outside as I tried desperately to bring my ex back to reality. "Yes, Elena, it's me." "Now listen." "Nathan," she interjected, still oblivious to the situation developing around her. "I'm so sorry, Nathan. I should have told you the truth. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." She paused, looking down at the still crying toddler in her arms. "Nathan, this is your son. Our beautiful baby boy." Masonry and debris were falling from the ceiling above me, and Victor was screaming in my ear. I had run out of time. "Elena," I cried, "that is not our son." She opened her mouth in dismay, replying angrily through trembling lips. "How dare you, Nathan? How dare you say that? Lena, we do have a son, but that's not him. This is all an illusion. You need to snap out of it right now." "You're wrong," she swore, while tightening her grip on the baby. I'd reached the end of my patience and decided that direct action was required. It broke my heart, but there was no other choice. I reached out, grabbing Mikita and pulling with all my strength. Elena reacted predictably, crying out as she desperately fought against me. "No, what are you doing?" "Let go," she exclaimed in dismay. But I couldn't stop. The struggle lasted for mere seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Elena fought with all her strength, but I was able to pry the baby from her arms, though her maternal screams chilled me to the bone. I held Mikita in my arms for a brief moment before his skin turned gray, and his tiny body crumbled to ashes, slipping through my fingers and falling to the ground. This event finally woke Elena from her trance, her eyes widening as she surveyed her surroundings. "What's happening?" she exclaimed in confusion. "Where am I?" Then she looked toward the doorway, and her face froze with horror. "Oh my God," she swore. I turned my head and saw what she meant. The circular chamber outside had now vanished, falling into the ever-expanding chasm, which was swallowing up everything in its path. And the small room we occupied was collapsing around us, the ground shaking as we dodged huge chunks falling from the ceiling. I looked into Victor's eyes and saw nothing but blind terror. I'd completed the task assigned to me, but was it already too late? We all feared the worst as the storm raged and the lighthouse crumbled. But suddenly, I felt an intense heat on my back. Turning around, I saw a swirling vortex of crimson, identical to the one I'd been pulled into during my previous test. "Thank God," Victor exclaimed as he darted forward, leaping into the portal without a second's hesitation. I went to follow, knowing that whatever lay on the far side was surely better than here. But when I glanced across at Elena, I saw she was frozen in place, staring into the vortex with terror in her eyes. "I can't," she muttered fearfully. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can." I shot back while grabbing hold of her hand and giving her a reassuring smile. "We'll go together." She smiled back at me, and then we were running hand in hand, entering the vortex seconds before the floor gave way. And then the darkness consumed us. We were in a different place now. Not heaven or hell, but another version of purgatory where we must remain until our sins are absolved. This prison takes the form of a dilapidated apartment block set in the middle of a dark, monster-ridden wasteland. We are sealed inside the building, and so are reasonably safe. Elena, Victor, and I are still bound together, forced to live in close quarters in this tiny flat. Our neighbors are a strange collection of lost souls, all serving their own sentences for various sins committed in the mortal realm. The building manager is an unusual man, helpful and courteous up to a point, although I sense a deep sadness in him and suspect he's on his own journey of redemption. This isn't a pleasant place to live, and the three of us often argue bitterly. But in a strange way, we three are like family now. And as unpleasant as this complex can be, we know there are far worse realms we could have been sent to. The keeper continues to oversee us, communicating occasionally through a one-way intercom installed in our apartment. We know there's still time to be served, and we're all willing to endure it, if only because we have hope for the future. We may be dead, but we still have dreams. Victor is waiting for the girlfriend he left behind, looking forward to their eventual reunion. As for Elena and me, our goal is to find our baby boy, to reach whatever level of the afterlife his innocent soul inhabits. When that day comes, we'll become the family we always should have been, and our past sins will be forgiven. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My oldest friend sent me a cryptic message. When I understood what it meant, I felt sick to my stomach. And that's precisely what happened next. I vomited and tried to continue reading. Now I wish I had never opened that letter, because of its implications, because of what it would do to me. Dear Michael, there are countless things I want to tell you, and not enough time to say them all. I wish we had more time together. How long has it been? 12 years since you escaped. I know you swore never to return to this place, and so far you've kept that vow. I hate that I'm going to make you break it, but you need to come back. Something is wrong here, with Haven Home itself. It's dying, Mike. The entire town is withering away, and no one will acknowledge it. They keep distributing brochures and online ads enticing tourists to capture photos of that cursed mine. But nobody seems willing to admit something about that place is just wrong. You knew the truth, Michael. I think that's why you fled. But you need to return home. Please, this town needs you. I needed you. It's too late for me, though. Too late to prevent what has happened. So don't do this for me. Do it for everyone else still here. We need you, Michael. Forgive me for disrupting your life. Eliza, I must have read through it 3 times, desperately trying to convince myself I had misunderstood its meaning. But I've known Eliza since elementary school. This wasn't just a cry for help. This was a farewell letter. I crumpled the paper and immediately checked social media to confirm my fears. Eliza had drowned the previous Friday. No one had bothered to notify me about the funeral. That made sense, considering I hadn't set foot in Haven Home for over a decade. Eliza was off by 2 years. I thought this July would mark 12 years since I abandoned the isolated mountain community of Haven Home. I contemplated my next move. I could simply ignore her letter, continue my life in Colorado, and forget about my past there. but her message disturbed me deeply because of what it mentioned. The mind. Most outsiders know nothing about Haven Home except one significant detail that our town council has promoted relentlessly since it happened. A massive cavern on the eastern edge of town is allegedly the impact site of an ancient meteorite. Yes, you heard correctly. Cosmic rocks, strange energies, the whole mysterious package. Our community has survived on that narrative for nearly 50 years. My grandmother, when she was still alive, claimed that the impact occurred during the late 1870s. The Civil War had ended a decade earlier, and most people were focused on rebuilding the nation. So a strange event in a remote mountain town barely made the news. According to her, an object was witnessed by local miners near Haven Home on the evening of September 23rd, 1877. It was described as an enormous boulder with a blue glow brighter than the moon. At a nearby government outpost, Commander Isaac Harrison authorized his men to intercept the object. And that's precisely what happened, according to Grandma. The meteorite was struck and fell on the eastern side of Haven Home, creating a deep crater that would later become what is now affectionately called Frost's Mine. Robert Frost was the first person to explore the site before government officials arrived and quarantined the entire area. Frost claimed he discovered a massive blue-white crystal inside the mine shaft, unlike anything he'd ever seen. But then federal agents removed him and sealed everything off. Or at least that's how the story goes. When the public was finally granted access to the site again, almost 9 years later, there was no meteorite or any evidence suggesting anything extraordinary had crashed there. Frost turned it into a tourist attraction anyway, establishing a gift shop, photo opportunities, and even a small cafe. The mine kept Haven Home's economy stable through the Great Depression and both world wars. However, in the late 1950s, careful researchers discovered that the site contained unusual radiation levels, and because the mine's contents were deemed potentially hazardous, the eastern section of Haven Home became inaccessible to the public. Decades passed with few details emerging, but eventually officials determined that the contamination levels weren't lethal as long as no one remained in the mine for extended periods. So the tourist attraction reopened, and Haven Home prospered once more. If I were the suspicious type, I'd wager that bribes exchanged hands to get that approval pushed through. I've only been around for 35 years, but I understand how money makes the world function. And I also knew that the strange radiation at Frost's mine had claimed many lives, including my father's. 13 years ago, I watched my mother spend every penny trying to prove that his work at the site caused his death. This is why I swore I had to leave and never look back. I couldn't let Dad's fate consume me like it had consumed her. Now, 12 years later, another death connected me to that accursed mine. This time, I couldn't just turn away. I checked my schedule and confirmed I could take time off for the funeral, then booked a bus to reach Haven Home. I didn't pack much since I wasn't planning an extended stay. I figured a couple of days would sort things out, and I might even leave before anyone realized I had returned. I suppose that was wishful thinking, because on the bus, I had the misfortune of encountering an old acquaintance. Victor Reeves, former captain of the Haven Home Hunters football team, was also traveling to the funeral. Never expected to see you here, Mike. Thought you disappeared for good, he remarked. It's personal. Eliza and I were best friends. I replied as I gazed toward the misty mountains surrounding the small town. It looked so desolate. Is that what she told you? Victor said with a slight laugh. Then he showed me a letter he'd received from Eliza. It was identical to the suicide note I had received. I took it, trying to hide my shock, then looked back toward the approaching town. Had Eliza manipulated me to return to this miserable place? If that was the case, my visit might be even briefer than anticipated. I thought bitterly as I returned the note to Victor. When I received it, I found the whole thing rather strange. I haven't spoken to her in years. I left Haven Home to build a better life. And I've done exactly that. I have a wife and children, a good job. This place hasn't crossed my mind once. Eliza's note was completely unexpected. How did she even find my address? And why would she ask me to come back to this forgotten town to investigate some weird mine? None of it makes sense, he told me. I regretted not considering all this before I left home. Victor was returning to seek answers, and I briefly thought about suggesting we work together. But we'd never gotten along, and I wasn't interested in reconciling now. So I remained silent as the bus approached the station, and the driver announced our arrival. As I gathered my luggage, it began to rain, drenching me as I hurried toward the taxi stand. Haven Home only had one taxi service 12 years ago, and from the looks of things, little had changed. I stood there in the downpour, debating whether to call a rideshare instead of sharing a vehicle with Victor Reeves. Then I noticed a woman holding a sign with my name on it, standing beside a black SUV. I couldn't help approaching her, surprised that anyone would be expecting me. She opened the car door, and I found myself face to face with the current owner of Frost's Mine and one of my old girlfriends, Natalie Frost. "Get in, Mike. We need to talk," she said. I didn't argue. I was puzzled about how she knew I would arrive, but she quickly explained the situation. "I see you received Eliza's letter. I got one too, by the way. Everyone who knew her did, urging us to return to Haven Home and investigate what's happening in that mine." Natalie told me as we drove away from the station. "Everyone? How many letters did she send?" I asked. "Over the years, many people have abandoned this town. I believe, counting you, I've identified 8 people so far who returned, because Eliza wrote them a suicide note and begged them to come home," Natalie explained. I remained silent as the storm intensified, and we drove toward the old and her family operated. Natalie mentioned she had rooms ready for me, and anyone else who received a note from Eliza. "I'm determined to discover the truth about my family's property," Natalie told me. "Your family's? Do you mean the Frosts no longer control the mine?" I asked as we pulled alongside the building, and Natalie offered me an umbrella. "My father lost it to creditors 3 years ago. Foolish man. This place was our financial lifeline. Now the new management has allowed me to stay on as property manager until my father's debt is settled. But that's not your concern, Michael. Just rest tonight. We'll talk tomorrow, and perhaps all of us can solve this mystery together," Natalie said. As I settled into my room, my thoughts kept returning to the strange notes Eliza had sent. When I first read it, I assumed it was a personal plea for me to return and solve the mystery of the mine. But now I realized I might not have been as close to her as I believed. Why had she summoned so many old friends back to Havenhome? And how did it connect to the mine that the Frost family had operated as a tourist attraction for decades? As I gazed out the window toward the eastern edge of Havenhome, I could see the narrow entrance to the mine stretching into complete darkness, like a wound that would never heal. Something unusual was occurring deep within its tunnels, and I needed to uncover what. I didn't believe in supernatural forces, but I was convinced this wasn't a natural phenomenon. Paranormal or not, I would find the truth. If not for Eliza, then for my own sanity. I had told myself for years that Havenhome was nothing but a painful memory I needed to escape. I told myself that my father's death was his own fault, and that my departure was necessary. I needed to be right about this, or the past 12 years would mean nothing. The funeral home was situated near the town center, an old wooden structure that likely dated back to the town's founding. Natalie promised we would discuss everything after the service, but honestly, my thoughts were on seeing my family at the church. I hadn't informed any of them about my return, so when my mother spotted me across the pews, I realized this trip was indeed a mistake. I tried to disappear into the crowd, but she found me as soon as the service ended. "You have the nerve to show up here," she shouted, pointing directly at my face. She looked terrible and smelled of alcohol. "Lower your voice," I instructed as I noticed townspeople giving us strange looks. "I don't see why I should. You come to your friend's funeral but couldn't be bothered to help bury your own father. Can we go somewhere private to discuss this?" I guided her toward the church entrance. Victor overheard our exchange and thought he should intervene like some noble hero. "Mrs. Thorne, is Mike bothering you? Stay out of this," I warned him. Words were exchanged that I won't repeat. Then he struck me. My mother prevented the fight from escalating and told me to come to her house. With a bloody, broken nose to tend to, I didn't argue. At her home, she treated my injury with unsteady, drunken hands, visibly torn between joy and anger at seeing me again. "You shouldn't have returned," she told me. "I'm beginning to realize that," I replied, holding an ice pack against my throbbing face. I told her about Eliza's note and the others who had received similar messages. Her face paled when I mentioned the mine. "You can't go down there. There's evil in that place. It killed your father," she muttered. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I urged her to explain what had happened 12 years ago. Though reluctant, she agreed to tell me on the condition that I wouldn't visit the mine. "It was a harsh winter. Your dad had just been laid off from the logging company on the west side of town. Despite working there for nearly 18 years, it meant nothing to them. Times were tough. Havenhome's economy was collapsing. The only business that seemed to survive was that cursed mine. Robert Frost still owned it then, and he gladly hired your father as a supervisor. They needed people willing to guide groups deeper into the mine. Thrill seekers, everyone trying to feel the energy from the meteorite. Complete nonsense, I thought, and your father agreed, as long as it provided us with enough to keep you fed. After those initial weeks of work, though, your dad started behaving oddly. He would volunteer for extra shifts, seeking larger groups to lead into the mine. He never explained exactly what they discovered down there, but his expression told me everything. There are secrets buried in that mine, Michael, and your father let them consume him. I later discovered that many of the tourists he guided never left Haven home, or at least there's no record of their departure. She showed me documents from Frost's mine. She had been collecting them, though I wasn't sure why. There were inconsistencies. The information didn't match what Dad had recorded. It seemed they were maintaining 2 separate logs. You're suggesting these people vanished in the mine? I asked. Something happened to them. Why is there no documentation of them leaving Haven home? She demanded. I shook my head, unwilling to accept such an outlandish claim. There are hundreds of people here, Mom. You can't conceal something like this. Not for this long, I told her. My skepticism angered her, and she retreated to her attic to retrieve one final piece of evidence. A journal my father had kept, which she claimed contained the truth about the mine. I examined the journal. Most entries were just ramblings and thoughts of Dad, trying to understand more about the mine's anomalies. Reading this showed me he was losing his grip on reality toward the end. The guilt over what happened to those people. It destroyed him, Mom said. Indeed, as I reached the final entries, his writing deteriorated into unintelligible scribbles, alongside bizarre drawings of crystalline formations and strange mathematical equations. When did you find all this? I whispered. 4 years ago. Took considerable effort to get Robert to surrender it. But I think he realized the mine was cursed too. I believe he intentionally lost ownership. Otherwise, had he remained in charge, I suspect he would have ended his own life as well. That night, I reviewed Dad's journal, noting what little I could comprehend. There were charts and geological surveys amid notes, referring to the government research facility on the northern edge of Haven home. According to these records, Robert Frost had an arrangement with a secret government agency to continue operating the site despite the radiation dangers. If true, this meant government officials were knowingly sending people into harm's way. But why? What was their objective? I knew the answers must lie within the mine. I called Natalie the next morning and asked about her father's current whereabouts. Dad, he's at Pinecrest Psychiatric Center. He lost his mind after losing the business, she told me. I thanked my mother for her help and hurried to the psychiatric facility. With only 1 day remaining in Haven home, I was determined to learn everything I could about this decades-old mystery. My initial theory was that the government was concealing some experimental technology in the mine. But my conversation with Robert Frost changed everything. On the drive to the facility, I devised a plausible excuse. Natalie had sent me as a family attorney. There were documents regarding the mine that required his signature, which he had neglected to complete 3 years ago. The story satisfied the staff, but when Mr. Frost met me in the common room, he wasn't fooled. "You're not our lawyer," he muttered as I closed the door. "You dated my Natalie. I remember you. Before you call the nurse to throw me out, you should examine this," I told him. I first showed him Eliza's suicide note, then my father's journal. "What is this supposed to mean to me?" Robert snapped. "Notice anything unusual. The handwriting here is identical. For years, people thought my father died insane, and then I believed the same about my closest friend. But that was part of a cover-up, wasn't it, Mr. Frost? I asked. He averted his gaze, which confirmed my suspicions. My mother believes that the people sent into that mine were being harmed. What was really happening to them? I pressed. Why don't you go there and find out yourself? He challenged. That's my next step, once I find a way in. From what I hear, the new owner has the same arrangement you had with the government. You knew those people were being used for some horrific experiment, didn't you? I accused. He shook his head and looked toward the window. You understand nothing, boy. You think this is just the government. Your perspective is so limited. This is far greater than anything humanity is prepared for, he whispered. The meteorite. You expect me to believe that a space rock is behind all this? I asked skeptically. I saw it, Michael. A massive crystal with blue veins of light. It spoke directly to my mind, distorted my thoughts. It controlled me. It's been controlling me all along. The crystal is what brought you back to this town, he whispered. My mouth felt dry as he finished speaking. It sounded preposterous. What would an ancient meteorite want with someone like me? Or Victor or Natalie? Why were we being gathered? Tell me the truth, Mr. Frost. Did you harm those people? I demanded. Instead of answering, he began smashing his head against the wall, and I shouted for assistance. By the time staff arrived, he had fallen unconscious. I quickly collected my documents and called Natalie to arrange a meeting near the mine. I think I understand something about the mine. Can you gather the others? I asked. Everyone except Victor is here. He went to Eliza's grave, she informed me. I told her to meet me at noon, then drove to the small cemetery. As Natalie had mentioned, Victor was standing by the grave. What do you want, Mike? He snapped when he noticed me. Natalie mentioned you were here. I wanted to make peace, I lied. I needed him to come to the mine since he had received Eliza's letter, which somehow connected him to whatever was happening. Looks like your mother patched you up. Guess I hit you too hard, he said with a shrug. What brings you back here? I asked, gesturing toward the grave. I think we're all wondering that. Natalie told me others received the same letter from Eliza. It feels like we've been drawn here for a reason, and I wish I knew why, Victor admitted. I tried not to reveal that I shared his confusion, but offered encouragement to gain his cooperation. The answers are in that mine. Natalie is gathering everyone there this afternoon. You should join us. I think the only way to understand what's happening is if we go together, I suggested. Victor shrugged and nodded, walking to his rental car. I'll be there. But if this turns out to be another wild goose chase, Mike, I'll finish what I started at the funeral. As he drove away, I wondered what he meant. What past incident did he consider pointless? I checked the time and collected my belongings before driving toward the mine. I hoped to solve this mystery and catch the evening bus back to Colorado, but that never happened. Upon arrival, I noticed that the once pristine buildings used for ticket sales and souvenirs looked dilapidated. The new management clearly wasn't maintaining appearances. I found everyone gathered near the entrance. Natalie seemed impatient about being summoned. Why did you call us here, Mike? She asked. The tour only works with a complete group. We go down together and discover the truth. It's that simple, I explained. That was another lie. I didn't want to admit it, but since my arrival, I had been deceiving the people closest to me. I wanted to uncover what the mine was hiding, and I was prepared to do whatever necessary to find out, even if it meant risking these people's safety. I wasn't certain we would be protected, but I had to press forward. The tour guide was an older man, probably not directly connected to the new owners. Like my father, this was just another local trying to earn a living. They requested our driver's licenses. They appeared pleased to see we were all locals. I hadn't verified this detail, but I found it strange. So many people had tried to escape Haven Home over the years, and now something had drawn us back. Robert Frost believed it was the meteorite itself. My mother thought it involved government conspiracy. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, as we all boarded a cart, and our guide drove us into the mine. Despite the sunny day outside, once we ventured deep enough, the rock walls blocked all natural light. It occurred to me that, although this place had profoundly impacted my life, this was my first time entering it. Perhaps I always sensed the danger, I thought. As we traveled, the guide recited the same old legend we'd all heard countless times. Of course, he omitted the radiation poisoning that nearly closed the mine permanently. But I decided to test my luck and ask, are people still getting sick? Is it truly safe down here? Why was this place closed for so long? I questioned. The guide gave me a cold stare as we reached the deeper sections, apparently not expecting anyone to know that part of the story. This place has never caused any harm. Those are just baseless rumors. It heals people. You'll see soon enough. He parked the cart and urged us to follow him deeper. The path led underground. We were all silent as we walked into the cave, and I asked Natalie if she had ever visited this part of the mine before. My father forbade it. He said he didn't want me to end up like the people he sent down here. That made my stomach churn as I asked the others the same question, and discovered none of us had ever been to this section of the mine before. But we all grew up here. We knew about this place. So why did we never come? I wondered aloud. As if to answer my question, the guide entered a code into a keypad on a door ahead of us and instructed us to enter a dark, cold chamber. But I saw something glowing inside. Mesmerized by it, I walked into the room and gazed at what appeared to be a pulsing blue-white crystal. It must have been at least the size of a small car. Strange markings covered its surface, but they resembled no human language I recognized. I couldn't help feeling my heart race. So it really was a meteorite this whole time? I asked in amazement. The guide laughed and remarked, "This is just a geological formation. Nothing extraordinary. But I'm not surprised you've heard the rumors about the meteorite. It's kind of our storyline to sell tickets. What are these markings then?" Victor asked as he reached toward the crystal. Before he could touch it, he jerked back. "It feels like the damn thing is electrified." "No idea. I just work here," the guide said, and encouraged everyone to take photos. "You'll notice your devices don't work down here anyway. People enjoy that mysterious aspect," he commented. I pulled Natalie and Victor aside, whispering to them, "We need to find a way to explore further. Something tells me this guide is only revealing half the story. "Let me handle this," Natalie said with a wink and approached the guide, beginning to flirt with him. I was impressed by how easily she manipulated him. It was like flipping a switch. "Makes you feel like you're back in high school," Victor said, nudging me with a laugh. A few moments later, after bribing the guide, he left us alone with the crystal. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "As much as we want, I guess. That old man doesn't know anything. And I'm starting to think there's nothing special here," Natalie said with a sigh. I suggested we should examine the rest of the chamber and look for any hidden passages. This couldn't possibly be all that was concealed here, I thought as we spread out to check the room's corners. As we searched, I noticed other markings matching those on the crystal near the floor. In fact, the entire chamber seemed somehow connected to the crystal. It made me wonder if, when the guide brought us inside, if we had entered something alive. "There's something here," Natalie said, pointing to a circular platform. It was large enough for a person to stand on. As we cleared away debris, I realized there were similar platforms around the room, each resembling a standing circle that a person could comfortably occupy. When Natalie stepped onto one, it sank slightly into the floor and emitted a blue glow similar to the central crystal. "There are enough platforms here for all of us. In fact, I think it's exactly the number of people in this room," Victor observed. We looked closer and determined he was correct. "Maybe something happens when we all stand on them simultaneously," I guessed. Everyone immediately wanted to try. I was the last to step onto a platform, and as soon as I did, I felt a disturbing sensation throughout my body. The room grew colder and more confining. "Darker. Something feels wrong," Natalie said. The others were already on their platforms, making it impossible to stop whatever we had set in motion. The crystal in the center began to glow more intensely, and I felt my body grow heavy. Then we started to float. "Michael, what's happening?" Natalie shouted. "I'm not sure. Try to push yourself toward the door," I told her. Just as I spoke, I saw the door sealing behind a wall of rock. We were trapped, and I felt like I was suffocating. The crystal began to spin, its light blinding me. I could feel my skin begin to blister and burn, cracking across my arms and turning my skin a pale blue. As suddenly as it began, we fell back to the ground, all gasping for air and fighting nausea. "What the hell just happened?" Victor demanded. None of us had an answer. I noticed the crystal was still spinning. "I don't think we're out of danger yet," I cautioned. Near where the door had been, I heard voices and saw individuals in hazmat suits entering the chamber. My arms felt too heavy to lift, but I tried to signal them. One raised a weapon toward Victor and ordered him to remain still. I soon realized these were government agents, likely investigating the disturbance. I raised my hands above my head, my vision adjusting to the room. That was when I saw Natalie. Her body was pale, and her skin looked almost crystalline, cracked and shimmering like the meteorite itself. I looked down at my own body and realized the same transformation had happened to me. Something in this room had changed us. The agents continued shouting commands as we struggled to stand. "Stop. We need help," Victor pleaded as one of the officers knocked him to the ground. They seemed unable to understand our words. Then they used the butt of their weapon and rendered him unconscious. I was next, I found myself barely able to resist. Everything went black before I could even scream. We awoke restrained to metal tables. It took me a moment to realize we were no longer in the mine. I couldn't call out to the others or check if they were all right. As I focused on the room's contents, I spotted a calendar near the door. June 1958. That couldn't possibly be accurate, I thought as I heard voices outside our holding area. The government officials had returned. A man in his late 50s entered the room and noticed I was conscious. "Water," he offered, uncapping a bottle. "You've made a mistake. We're civilians. We live in Haven Home," I told him. "Son, I know exactly who you are. I've been anticipating this day for nearly 80 years, he remarked. I studied his face, trying to determine if he was lying or simply delusional. "You don't look a day over 55, and that would be generous. What's happening here? Are you involved in the cover-up at Frost's mine?" I demanded. "You ask many questions. Frost's has been closed for years. In fact, we were waiting for your arrival to reopen it," he said as he sipped his water and approached the next table. The person there struggled against their restraints as the officer inserted a syringe into their chest. "You have no idea what you've become, do you, son?" he asked. He turned and showed me. He had extracted a vial of blood that glowed with the same blue light as the crystal in the mine. "I know you're violating our rights." "I have an attorney in Colorado," I protested. "Your attorney hasn't even been born yet." "You think I'm joking?" The man said and activated a nearby television, showing a news broadcast. "This is 1958. You know we're from the future." "Who are you?" My mind reeled with this information as he drew my blood as well and smiled. "I'm here to ensure you fulfill your destiny." As he left, I turned to the other person, wishing I could break free. None of this made sense, but I was determined to help us escape. Hours later, masked scientists arrived and began injecting chemicals into the other prisoner. The government official observed and documented the process as the tests continued. My friend initially writhed in agony, but eventually became so overwhelmed they simply lay there, enduring the experiments. "What are you trying to achieve?" I asked the official. "The 8 of you come from the year 2013. That's over 50 years ahead of our time. Yet you've traveled backward through time, and your physical body will continue to regress the longer you remain here. Such an ability is remarkable and worth studying. It could potentially help all of humanity overcome aging," he explained. "So we're just your lab rats," I shouted angrily. 70 years ago, you appeared in the mine like light descending from heaven. You had nearly lost all human characteristics. But after we recovered your bodies from the crystal chamber, we discovered the truth. Despite your altered appearance, your cellular structure remained human. We've been studying it ever since. I'm living proof that the treatment works. I should have died decades ago, but your blood has kept me alive." Even as he finished speaking, he injected himself with the glowing blood, smiling cruelly as we were subjected to more tests. "So yes, you will be my test subjects for as long as possible. It's for humanity's benefit, you understand," he laughed. Something deep inside me became enraged. I started to feel as I did in the cave, my skin blistering and burning. I felt energy surge through my limbs as they broke free from the restraints. The scientist nearby tried to sedate me, but I overpowered them and released the person beside me. "We need to find the others," I said, my body feeling unnaturally light as I searched the corridor. The adjacent rooms contained our friends, and as I began using my newfound strength to break down their doors, I discovered some of them barely resembled humans anymore. I entered the next laboratory, where Victor was thrashing on the floor like a wild animal. His body was distorted, his skin crystalline and glowing, and his eyes bulged as he struggled to breathe. I realized in that horrifying moment where the stories of the blue cave lights originated from. They were transforming people like us into these creatures. I realized as Victor desperately reached toward me. I knew I couldn't help him. I sealed the door and told the others to ensure it remained closed. "We're running out of time. We need to escape," Natalie said as she joined us. The transformation hadn't affected her as severely, but she was struggling. Deep crystalline patterns marked her face, and I wondered if we would even be able to breathe normal air once the metamorphosis completed. Natalie witnessed Victor's condition and fought to maintain composure, directing the others as we moved to the upper floor of this facility. As we reached the stairwell, I heard the door we had sealed break apart. It sounded like an explosion. Victor was pursuing us, and he was furious, attacking anyone in his path. Ahead of us, guards attempted to block our escape, but I found myself behaving like Victor. Whatever they had done to us granted us extraordinary strength, allowing us to throw them aside effortlessly. As we reached the facility's exit, I found myself paralyzed by the intensity of the sunlight. Natalie screamed and collapsed, her eyes no longer able to tolerate the light. Guards surrounded us, and I thought our escape was futile. The official who had first discovered us approached me, smiling. "Incredible. You're exactly like the beings I encountered 70 years ago. You're miraculous. The next evolution of humanity," he observed. He ordered us to be taken to the crystal chamber. Despite our resistance, we were loaded onto a truck and transported back to Havenholm. To the mine. I questioned my sanity as I watched the countryside pass by. When we reached the mine, the soldiers led us through a different tunnel. This one was lined with crystalline formations that resembled frozen bodies fused with the cave walls. Except I understood these entities were once human like us, taken from our present, brought to this cruel past to be experimented on. We had been manipulated from the beginning, I thought, as we were forced back into the crystal chamber. Despite Victor's absence, our bodies began experiencing the same symptoms as before. I prayed for unconsciousness. The room around us began to glow and shimmer, and we were again thrust into an unknown realm. This environment looked completely different than before. The cave resembled a control center. I stumbled toward one of the displays to understand our location, but the readings made no sense. If I interpreted them correctly, we were floating above Earth's surface. An alarm blared near the crystal. Natalie reached for it with her crystallized fingers and activated a communications device. "Unidentified object. This is Commander Isaac Harrison. Stand down immediately or face consequences," a voice demanded. "No, please no. I think they're going to shoot us down," Natalie said. My head was spinning, but I understood what was happening even as the monitors indicated projectiles were being fired at us. We had been thrown into the distant past, to when the meteorite first struck Havenholm, except we were inside the object that was about to crash. The vessel began to disintegrate as the weapons struck us, and I grabbed onto anything stable. The massive crystalline structure hurtled toward the ground. Rock, glass, and debris crashed around us as we impacted. With merciful darkness my only comfort as I became trapped beneath the rubble. I'm uncertain how long I remained there. When I heard approaching voices, I saw government agents firing at my friends, killing them without realizing they were harming their fellow humans. I found strength to call out, and the officers hesitated when my voice sounded human. They merely stunned me instead and pulled me from the debris, dragging me to a transport that would take me from the mine. As I left the crystal chamber now buried within the cave, I apologized to Natalie, hearing her pained voice beg for release as I was taken away. Approximately 30 minutes later, I was in chains before the same man I had seen in 1958, except he appeared much younger. "You speak our language?" Harrison asked as several of his scientists collected samples of my blood. "I'm from the future. I'm human just like you," I told him weakly. "Human? That's impossible. Such an extraordinary claim requires evidence," he stated. I used the only strategy available and provided several details about coming years, including what would occur in Havenholm. The commander thoughtfully considered this information. "Remarkable. Such technology exceeds our wildest imagination. I regret to inform you, but you'll need to remain here under observation. We must learn everything possible about this meteorite and the abilities it gave you," Harrison ordered. "Should we place him with the other?" an officer asked. The commander nodded, and I was escorted to the barracks. In my cell, I mourned my friends. Natalie, Victor, and the others had died because of my actions. I thought as I noticed another figure in the shadows across the room. The silhouette seemed familiar, yet different. I moved closer and called out to them. Then I heard a voice I couldn't mistake. "Michael, you received my letter," the voice said. "Eliza, what have they done to you?" I gasped as I saw her transformed body. We both had lost our former humanity. "Nothing I didn't anticipate. I knew you would eventually arrive here. It was inevitable," Eliza said pensively. "The others are dead, Eliza," I told her. She appeared unmoved by this news, her crystalline eyes gleaming like stars. In our original timeline, I entered the mine like many before us. I wanted to discover what secrets it held, and I was thrust into the past, just like you. They tortured me, experimented on me, and subjected me to unimaginable horrors that no person should endure. Then I realized I was no longer human. The crystal, the meteorite, it changed me. Forces beyond our comprehension have manipulated time and space for us to fulfill their purpose. And I finally understood why when the crystal communicated with me, sending me to this distant era, Eliza whispered. I moved closer, struggling to comprehend her words. It sounded like madness, but after everything I had witnessed, I knew it must be true. The crystal, is that the true alien entity? I guessed. It's been reshaping our bodies for a purpose, Michael. Don't you see? We're ushering in humanity's next chapter. Our world will be forever transformed by what they've done to us, she explained. You mean the crystal manipulated us? sending us backward in time because it knew these agents would use us as test subjects, I realized. You saw the formations in the mine. More fuel for its endless hunger, Michael. We are merely its servants now. The government agents are no different, even if they don't recognize it. Their thoughts and actions are all driven by their greed and ambition for power. Power the crystal will never truly grant them, she told me. I found myself unable to stand, the overwhelming futility of my existence crushing me as I trembled and wept. I had tried so desperately to escape Haven Home, but it had always been part of me. Everyone and everything I ever knew was merely a component in the mechanism of a power beyond my comprehension. Now my only hope was eventual death, either by the agent's hands or the alien force that had transformed my body into its image. How long will we remain here, Eliza? I asked. My friend made a strange sound, but didn't move. She too had resigned herself to this fate. Forever. I believe we're trapped here for our entire existence. And even after death, we become integrated with the living meteorite that altered our bodies. This town, all of this, we are simply fuel for its appetite, she whispered. I wanted to cry and laugh simultaneously, but my only real response was rage. That anger eventually gave way to silence over the years, as the agents repeatedly used us for their experiments, unaware they were being manipulated by the very meteorite that had crashed so long ago. Eventually, I knew I would become part of the crystal too, like so many others. My only purpose during these years became documenting this account, concealing it from view, and preserving it for the future. Someday, perhaps in the time I originated from, someone will discover this record and learn the truth about Haven Home. There are aliens here, and we are the monsters they have made. My thoughts. No living being has experienced more suffering than clinical trial subject T33. T33 was a healthy male who volunteered to be a test subject for a trial of a drug called Temporex. Temporex typically yields mild improvements in information processing and cognition. T33 had a different reaction to the drug. I'm the research scientist who administered the dose of Temporex to this poor man, and I consulted with his doctors in the ER after he was found collapsed beneath a bench at the Oak Ridge subway station. I have first-hand knowledge of the devastating trauma that a Temporex cross-reaction can produce, so I couldn't understand why someone would beg me to put them through what T33 had experienced. Then I took the drug myself. Temporex is essentially a neural pathway accelerator paired with a protein that binds to certain dendritic neuroreceptors. It makes signals flow faster through the brain. A lot faster. When I administered a mental speed assessment to subject T33 30 minutes after I gave him 25 milligrams, he was able to perform incredible, inhuman mental feats. He finished a 50-word word search in 3 seconds, solved a maze drawn onto poster-sized paper in 2 seconds. His mind worked fast enough to catch thrown cereal with chopsticks. Temporex had pushed him well into the superhuman range of thinking speeds. His mental speed was still accelerating when he left our offices. I told him to enjoy the extra time he would seem to have, since to his super-accelerated brain, minutes would seem like hours. At the time, I thought T33 would view the drug's effect as a positive thing. I pictured him at home, happily speed reading through books he wanted to find time to read. That's what I would have done. Or so I thought. It didn't occur to me that from his point of view, just getting home from our office would seem like it took days. He must have experienced hours of perceived time just in the elevator from our office. A day waiting for the next train, and another day crammed inside a crowded and smelly subway car. If I'd thought of that while he was still in the office, maybe I wouldn't have just sent him on his way with nothing more than a Temperex trial pamphlet. But what happened to T33 was much worse than experiencing the equivalent of days on the subway. 19 minutes after I sent him home, I got a call from the ER at Memorial Hospital. A man had been found behaving bizarrely under a bench in the Oak Ridge subway station. By the time he reached the ER, he was unresponsive. Personnel in the ER found the Temperex trial pamphlet in his pocket and called my lab. I took a blood sample and ran an engram decay test. I'm oversimplifying the neuroscience here, but basically, the cells in a conscious brain continuously make new connections and tear down existing connections. The new connections represent learning, and the torn down connections represent forgetting. When we sleep, cerebrospinal fluid washes away the metabolic debris from this activity. The test I ran measures how much engram decay, forgetting, has happened since the last sleep cycle. Engram decay is a good way of measuring the equivalent duration of consciousness, how long a patient has perceived they have been awake. We use this in the Temperex trials to measure the acceleration in thinking speed. More engram decay means the subject has perceived a longer period of consciousness. T33's engram decay results were incomprehensibly large. I ran the sample 3 times to make sure nothing was wrong with the lab equipment. I got the same result each time. Subject T33's brain had run so fast that in the 90 minutes between leaving the lab and winding up in the ER, he had perceived 8 million years of consciousness. The man had been awake so long in his perceived time frame that he had forgotten everything. Literally, his mind had been running so fast that even the nearly instantaneous act of blinking would be perceived as thousands of years of darkness from his massively sped-up perspective. His view of the subway station from under the bench must have been an eternal, unchanging scene. The near-complete lack of mental stimulation he experienced, and the 8 million years of perceived time were utterly devastating. His brain tore itself down in an act of forgetting. The ER sent me an fMRI scan. His cortex had no activity. His gray matter was essentially a collection of disconnected neurons. At the time, we had no way of knowing what caused this extreme side effect, but we noted that his blood work showed that he had recently taken his sleeping aid. We guessed that the 25 milligram dose of Temperex, already unusually active in this subject, interacted with the sleeping drug. I compiled everything I had on T33 into a report and sent it to the head office. The company published an adverse drug reaction bulletin, and the Temperex trial was put on indefinite hold. I never learned what happened to subject T33. 2 months later, I was in my office preparing for a trial of a new blood pressure medication when the receptionist called. "There's a woman here to see you," then he whispered. She said she didn't need an appointment because of who she is. I met my unexpected visitor in the lobby, a woman in her late 30s or early 40s. She wore a gray business suit and had a worn-out blue backpack slung over her shoulder. She introduced herself as soon as I walked into the busy lobby, as if she already knew what I looked like. My name is Jessica Mayer. I work for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and I need to talk to you about Temperex. As soon as we got to my office, she pulled a stack of papers from her backpack and dropped them on my desk. It was the Temperex Adverse Drug Reaction Bulletin. I need you to do this to me. You want me to induce the worst adverse drug reaction I've ever heard of in you. On purpose. The bulletin says that a high dose of flumazenil could potentially reverse the reaction. I want you to induce the adverse Temperex reaction in me, and when I give the signal, administer flumazenil to slow my mind back down. The bulletin says potentially, could potentially. That's 2 weasel words in a row. The bulletin has a mandatory future research section they needed material for, so they put in the only wild-ass idea they had. In reality, nobody knows how to prevent, induce, or reverse this reaction. I'm okay with uncertainty. Why would you want to do this to yourself? For what purpose? Science. I want to watch someone die with my own eyes in extreme slow motion. I thrust the bulletin back at her. Whoever you are, Ms. Mayer, your idea of what science is, and mine, are profoundly incompatible. I won't help you destroy your brain. I won't participate in what sounds to me more like a satanic death ritual than clinical research. 6 weeks later, I found myself escorted through security in Building B182 at the Sanderson Research Complex. My escort, Dr. Jessica Mayer. Those 6 weeks opened my eyes to what a truly well-connected person can accomplish, no matter how demented their goals. Dr. Mayer had somehow gotten a national interest exemption to the Temperex ban. I received the original document, signed by the director of the National Security Council herself. Frankly, until then, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a national interest exemption to a restricted drug. Jessica had also somehow influenced the directors of the huge pharmaceutical company that developed Temperex. The CEO phoned me and asked me to participate in Dr. Mayer's important experiment. I asked her if she knew exactly what Jessica was doing. She said she had no idea and didn't care, and just told me to give her whatever help she needed. The way she said it made it abundantly clear that I was not to ask any questions. Of course, I did have questions. Why do I have to participate in this? Was at the top of my list. But I had already received a counseling letter from HR complaining about my lack of judgment for letting T33 go home while he was still in the grip of Temperex. I felt pressure to lay down and go with the flow, and that's exactly what I did. Jessica met me in the lobby of the massive office building. When she visited me at my office, she wore a gray business suit. Today she was wearing a white lab coat with Mayer embroidered above the pocket. Thank you for coming. I trust you have the drugs. I showed her what I brought. A 100 milligram vial of Temperex HCl. She had requested the Temperex be compounded in an injectable form, and a box of ambient pills. I also had a single vial of flumazenil, which, according to the hastily written adverse reaction bulletin, could potentially reverse the Temperex cross-reaction with ambient. The guard in the lobby gave me a blue badge displaying the letter E for escort required, and Jessica led me into the offices beyond. Jessica's office was a windowless chamber with a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard covering all 4 walls and even the back of the door. Equations and strange diagrams featuring stars and circles and what looked like electrical engineering symbols, or maybe ancient runes, filled the whiteboards. Jessica watched me gape at the weird symbology that surrounded us. She laughed. "It's just math. These," she pointed at the markings that looked like ancient runes, "are just stochastic tensors. The whole thing is just a giant probabilistic differential." "Never mind." She thrust a clipboard of paperwork at me. "Sign these, please. They're non-disclosure agreements." I worked through the paperwork while Jessica rummaged around in the piles of binders and boxes in the corner of her office. "You can wear this," she said, and handed me a lab coat. I handed her the signed paperwork and put on the lab coat. "You're going to destroy your brain, you know." The patient who had the cross-reaction was left with a completely unconnected cortex. "There's no coming back from that. Thank you for your concern, but I have a plan." I sighed. This was really happening, and I was a part of it. "What's the plan?" "I'm going to predose with the sleeping aid. I will also take 50 milligrams of dexamphetamine, so I don't fall asleep. Then we wait. Wait for what? We wait for the test subject to die." When Jessica visited my office and told me she wanted to watch someone die, I thought she was a lone lunatic, someone who did their own research. You know what I mean. I was completely wrong. Whatever Jessica was up to, it had the full support of important people. The head of the freaking NSC signed the National Interest Exemption Memo. And apparently it is in the national interest to overdose Jessica on an experimental psychoactive drug and let her watch someone die. Is this an animal study? The test subject is a human with a terminal disease. He volunteered to participate in this experiment. She turned to her desk and sorted through a stack of papers and folders. She found what she was looking for and handed me a green folder. "We have Institutional Review Board approval for this. I know it's a little unusual, but everything that we're doing today is approved." I remembered telling Jessica that her experiment sounded more like a satanic death ritual than legitimate science. Now in Jessica's office, with the walls full of strange mathematical symbols and diagrams of stars inside of circles, the same thought again occurred to me. Despite all the trappings of authority and approval, I cannot see how this ludicrous experiment was legitimate science. The phone rang. Jessica answered with a terse yes. Whoever was on the other end of the call spoke briefly. "We will be right there," Jessica said, and hung up the phone. "We have to go to the aperture chamber. I will explain the plan in more detail when we get there." We marched out of her office, Jessica in the lead. We wound through the halls of her second-floor office suite, then into the stairwell. We descended 10 floors through the fire doors at the bottom of the stairwell, then into another security vestibule. More checking of IDs, more signatures on sign-in sheets. I put my phone in a small cubby. I was given a second badge that read detain and blindfold if unescorted. Then we passed through a glass-enclosed, one-person-at-a-time man-trap and into a long corridor. I read the signs on the doors we passed. Some were normal basement corridor sorts of things. Electrical, custodial closet, HVAC. Then the signs got weirder. Pharmacy, theology, hospice. We stopped at a door fitted with a small sign that said aperture chamber. Jessica entered her code into the keypad lock. I heard the lock click and open, and I had a sudden flash of fear. Panic almost. The feeling was more than just a strong distaste for whatever Jessica was doing. I sensed that whatever was behind the door was wrong. Not just ethically wrong or scientifically misguided, but cosmically wrong. And dangerous. Jessica held the door for me, and I entered the room in which I would spend the next 120 years. The aperture chamber was a gigantic space, unlike a Walmart with all the shelving removed. Flawless white tile floor reflected the ranks of hundreds of fluorescent lights that hung from the ceiling 50 feet above us. A hospital bed was positioned in the center of a raised circular platform in the center of the room. Even from the door, a good 150 feet away, I could tell that there was a patient in the bed. A vital signs monitor stood to the left of the bed. A man sat in a metal folding chair on the right. The platform was surrounded by heavy machinery. Huge cams mounted on shiny stainless steel shafts were linked to a maze of interlocking rails that surrounded the bed platform. A tangle of brightly colored cables wove through the equipment like tree roots or caterpillars, giving the apparatus the look of something organic. Another raised platform stood outside of the ring of machinery. Instead of a bed, this platform held a black leather reclining chair that was oriented so that whoever sat in it could observe the test subject. At least 24 computer monitors were mounted on a metal framework surrounding the chair. Jessica led me to this second observation platform. The test subject, she pointed at the patient in the hospital bed, stopped oral intake 6 days ago and lost consciousness 36 hours ago. We are monitoring his respiration and mandibular movement. We believe he will die in the next 2 hours. Who is the man sitting next to him? That's his son. Our protocols specify that the terminally ill test subjects must be comforted by one family member. Because both the test subject and the family member must have top secret clearance, finding test subjects that match the protocol criteria is quite tedious. Something about the way she said this suggested she thought having family members present was a waste of resources. We climbed a short flight of steps to the observation platform with the leather chair. The chair faced the center of the platform with the hospital bed where the test subject lay dying. 2 huge mounting stands holding a dozen computer monitors each stood to the left and right, framing the view of the hospital bed. The monitors flashed and flickered patterns that appeared to be random noise. Jessica walked to the leather chair, and I stumbled behind, slack-jawed, trying to make sense of this bizarre experiment, or whatever it was. Jessica continued talking to me, oblivious to my confusion. I'm going to predose with the ambient and dexamphetamine now. The dexamphetamine will counteract the ambient, so I should have no problem staying awake. We will wait until his respiration slows to 6 breaths per minute. Then you will inject me with 40 milligrams of Temporex. She sat in the chair, a surprisingly ordinary reclining armchair. Please put the drugs here. She gestured to a small table to her right that held a tall glass of water and a prescription bottle labeled dexamphetamine. Bolted to the left arm of the chair was a gray metal box that held a small garden of switches and lights. A large red mushroom-shaped button labeled Dose Now stood above the others. Once the test subject dies and I have observed what I need to see, I will press the Dose Now button, and you will immediately inject me with 200 milligrams of flumazenil. She pointed to her left shoulder. A small square of fabric had been cut out of the lab coat, exposing her shoulder. This is where you will inject the Temporex. You will inject the flumazenil directly into my neck. I will need it to act as rapidly as possible. Jessica, did you actually read the bulletin about T-33? He perceived being conscious for 8 million years. His mind was gone when he got to the ER, completely devoid of cortical connections. His suffering was unimaginable. I've done the math, she replied testily. With the dosage I'll receive, I expect to experience only 300 to 500 years of consciousness. It should be a nice break, frankly. A nice break. Nice. 500 years. Years of just sitting in this chair, watching a corpse, while these monitors flash noise at you. Those monitors are displaying reading material. That one, she pointed to the upper left monitor, on the right side bank of crazy flashing screens, is displaying Wikipedia pages at a rate of 500 per second. The one next to it is scrolling through 20,000 works of English literature at 500 pages per second. And so on for the rest of the monitors. News archives, scientific publications, social media, and so on. We bought special monitors with the 500 Hz refresh rate just so we could display information fast enough. I stared at the 2 banks of flashing screens. I couldn't perceive anything but painfully bright flickering. You're going to read for 500 years while you observe that poor man over there and catch up on a few emails. She rotated a computer keyboard out of a slot in the arm of the chair. Let's get ready, shall we? She produced a headset from the pocket of her lab coat and put it on her head. This is Jessica Mayer. This is the audio record of Observation Activity 54. Observation 54. How long had she been watching people die in this bizarre room? Jessica continued talking into her headset. Current time is 14:23. I am pre-dosing with 1 ambient and 50 milligrams of dexamphetamine. She popped an ambient out of the blister pack and downed it with a swallow of the water. Then she took 2 pills from the dexamphetamine bottle and swallowed them. Now, she said, turning to me, we wait. She pressed a few keys on her keyboard. One of the monitors in the right bank of screens stopped flickering, and instead displayed a standard computer desktop background. Jessica clicked on icons and slid windows around the screen. When she was done, the screen held 3 windows. At the top of the screen was a data strip slowly updating graphs of what I assumed were the patient's test subjects, vital signs, blood pressure, respiratory rate, blood oxygen, and so on. Below that was Jessica's email box, 1,478 unread items, and a word processing window open to a blank page. I understand that once the Temporex kicks in, audio energy will be attenuated to the point where I cannot hear anything. I will not have enough fine muscle control or breath control to speak, so I will type my observations and anything else I need to communicate here. Move the mouse cursor to the word processing window, please. Keep an eye on it as we proceed. It will be the only way I have to communicate. We waited. Jessica ignored me while she read and wrote emails. The patient's respiration slowly decreased. I wandered off the platform to get a closer look at the machinery surrounding the patient. "Stay away from that area," Jessica shouted at me. "I'm going to start the aperture sequence soon, and there are a lot of mechanical hazards present when it's operating." Feeling a little like a chastised child, I sauntered to the short flight of stairs leading to the platform with the hospital bed. Aside from Jessica, the dying man and his son were the only two people in the huge room. Or chamber, or whatever. The test subject was an emaciated man who looked to be at least 90 years old. He slept. Rather, he was in a state of unconsciousness that did not look at all restful. His bony, withered body barely made a dent in the soft mattress of the hospital bed. Bruises up and down both arms betrayed a long battle with disease that required a lot of intravenous medicines. "Hey," I said to the son, a middle-aged man sitting next to the patient. He looked up from the book he was reading. Before he could speak, Jessica shouted across the chamber, "No communication with personnel on the test subject platform." The patient's son rolled his eyes and whispered to me, "Jessica's a bit of a stickler for protocol." I nodded in agreement and wandered back towards Jessica on the observation platform. I walked about, examining but failing to understand the machinery surrounding the test platform. I stared at the flashing banks of screens, trying and failing to perceive even a single screen of content. I stood behind Jessica and surreptitiously read a few of her outgoing emails. Subject: risk analysis of aperture capture experiment subject. Military benefits of applied theological research subject. Time card failed floor check. Jessica glanced back at me with a glare that clearly communicated that she did not appreciate me reading emails over her shoulder. I returned to strolling about the perimeter of the room. An hour passed, and then another. I thought about Jessica's plan to spend centuries of perceived time in this room. I had only been here 2 hours, and I was desperately looking forward to getting the hell out. To spend multiple lifetimes here, to look forward to spending lifetimes here, was a sign that Jessica was different. "It's time," Jessica shouted at me across the room. I jogged to the observation platform. Jessica had already prepared the injection of Temporex. On the far platform, the son was standing over the bed, holding his father's hand. Jessica was speaking into her headset when I got to the top of the stairs. "Blood pressure is dropping. Respiratory rate is down to 6. The probability of death in the next 10 minutes is over 90%. Starting the aperture stabilizers." She flicked a few switches on the control box that held the dose now button. A klaxon blared. Red cop car style lights on the machinery started flashing. The apparatus surrounding the patient slowly came to life. Motors hummed with rising pitch. Shafts turned faster and faster, their cams pushing a strange grid of beams up and down. The fastest moving parts of the machine started to glow and flash, giving it the look of a carnival ride. The machine spun and gyrated faster and faster. The grid of glowing beams blurred. The machine kept accelerating, and the seemingly random flashes became synchronized with the movement of the grid beams, resolving into a glowing blue sphere that rocked in crazy, unpredictable ways. Aperture device trim active. Dosing with Temporex now. Jessica spoke into her headset. She handed me the syringe. Dose me with the Temporex, then stay on this platform and watch my log entries and what happens when I press the dose now button. 200 milligrams of flumazenil in the neck. Yes. Prepare the injection now. There must be absolutely no delays when I press the button. I took the syringe of Temporex from her. You're probably not going to survive this, you know. You will suffer terribly for what you perceive as centuries. Eventually, your mind will tear itself down in a catastrophic act of forgetting. I'm aware of the risks. Now inject me. I did. Jessica was quiet for a minute. She looked at the patient on the far platform. She stared at the flashing computer monitors. Then she snapped her head to face me and said, "I think it's starting to take effect." She blurted the words out almost too fast to hear. "Your perception is definitely accelerated. Maybe about 10 times faster." Jessica turned away from me so fast that she almost fell out of her chair. She dotted her hands to the keyboard and typed. The key presses sounded more like a drum roll than a human using a keyboard. "I can hear you, but your voice is slowed and frequency shifted. I cannot understand. I will communicate through this screen. Please type your response to me here." I leaned over her keyboard and typed, "How long does it seem to take for my pen to fall?" I stepped in front of Jessica. Her eyes were darting about in a frenzy. Her gaze oscillated between me and the computer monitors and the patient on the far platform. I pulled a pen out of my pocket and dropped it on the floor. Jessica drumroll typed her response. "Days to fall. Sound is gone. Time to get to work." Jessica did exactly what she said she would do. She jerked her head back and forth between the screens, reading whatever information they were flashing her. She opened emails and slammed text into the response window. Occasionally, her eyes would linger on the patient in the center of the whirling machinery. Then she would return to the frenzy of reading and writing. Minutes ticked by. I tried to calculate how long she perceived those 3 minutes to be. If the quarter-second drop of my pen seemed to take days for her, then each second that ticked by would seem to her to be about a week. 3 minutes would be over 3 years. I watched her closely. She didn't appear to be suffering. She could push the dose now button at any time, but so far had chosen not to. Her pattern of frenzied motion and typing suddenly ceased. She fixed her gaze on the patient for a second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Were they weeks of her time? Jessica shot her fingers at the keyboard again. This time she typed a message in the journal window. "He's dead." Chaos broke out a moment after Jessica typed her message. The vital signs monitor threw up a red warning message. Respiratory 0. Heart rate 0. Jessica's hands raced over the control panel in a blur, flicking switches and turning dials. The churning satanic carnival ride of a machine came to an abrupt stop with a screech and a bang. The floor shook as the foundation of the building absorbed the forces involved with bringing tons of spinning and thrashing metal to an instant stop. The blue sphere glowed brighter than ever, held fixed at a strange angle by the frozen machine. In the same instant, the patient's son screamed in pain, and he fell to the floor. Well, no, it wasn't that simple. I looked closer and saw that he didn't fall. His legs collapsed under him, bent like they were made out of rubber or melting plastic. His legs continued to melt until his torso sat on the platform in a pool of red goo. The man tried to scream again, but the severe trauma, or whatever it was that ruined his legs, started to affect his abdomen. With his diaphragm destroyed, screaming was impossible. So was breathing. Every instinct in me urged me to run to the door, to get out of that room. But I had a duty to administer the antidote to Jessica. I would not be responsible for another person going through what T-33 had. Jessica hammered out another message. He's taken his second death in the aperture. Dose yourself with Temporex now, or you will die. I had no idea what the first line of Jessica's message meant. Second death. Aperture. Those words meant nothing to me, but the second line I understood. And there was no way I would dose myself with that drug. To live 1,000 lifetimes in this bleak underground facility. I'd rather die. On the far platform, the son of the man who apparently died 5 seconds earlier continued to dissolve. His chest splashed apart like a breaking water balloon. His head and arms fell into the puddle that his body had made, floated like a horrific pool toy for a moment, then melted away. I had seconds to think about what Jessica wrote. Take the drug and live. He took his second death in the aperture. What would happen to me if I didn't take the Temporex? Would I literally liquefy, like the son of the test subject? As bad as that looked, it would be far better than 8 million years of sensory deprivation that T-33 experienced. What the hell did second death even mean? But where I only had seconds to think, Jessica, in her hyper-accelerated mental state, had the equivalent of days to decide what I should do, to decide what she would do to me. I turned from the screens to look at Jessica. She was staring at me, studying me with unblinking eyes. For her, every slight micro-expression that flashed across my face, every tiny change in my body language, would be an hours-long process. She probably knew what I was going to do before I did. I was not going to take the drug. Jessica rose from the chair before I could even nod my head to signal no to her. Her proprioception system was running 10,000 times faster than her body. With that kind of disconnect in mind and body control, moving normally would be nearly impossible. Jessica discovered this problem as she tried to stand up. She misjudged the force required and literally threw herself from the chair. In another setting, her fall to the floor would have been comical. She launched herself in a twisting arc. Her arms and legs flailed about wildly, but she was unable to control her fall. She landed face first on the platform and continued to thrash her limbs uselessly for a few seconds. From her warped perspective in time, her fall must have taken a day or two. These futile efforts on the floor occupied a week of her time. Whatever else Jessica may be, it's pretty clear that she's smart as hell. She can figure stuff out and learn quickly. That's exactly what she did on the floor. She froze, then methodically began moving one limb at a time. She lifted one leg, then let it drop. She brought her other knee to her torso. She pushed herself up onto her left elbow. She steadied herself with her right arm. Then she rose. For a moment, I thought she was going to fall again, but her movements this time were more controlled, purposeful. She had learned how to move under the influence of Temporex. Blood ran from her mouth and nose, where she smacked her face on the floor. She glanced at the far platform. The test subject's sun was still busily liquefying. Then she turned towards me. Her movements were more like a bird's than a human's. A sequence of blindingly fast motions punctuated by short intervals of motionlessness. She moved sideways with a lurching twitch and grabbed the syringe and the vial of Temporex from the table next to the chair. Her eyes continued to burn into mine as she stabbed the needle through the seal of the vial and filled the syringe. No, I knew shouting was useless because she couldn't hear, but fear had decoupled my mouth from my brain. Panic and fear replaced all other thoughts. I turned to run. I started to turn anyway. Jessica had hours to watch me slowly shift my posture and start to engage my muscles. She lunged at me, perfectly anticipating where my neck would be when her arm reached me. For her, the physical struggle must have been an intellectual activity, like chess, and not a physical endeavor like fighting. In the split second I tried to get away, she had analyzed my face for tells, saw all the small ways my body telegraphed what I was going to do, then calmly made a plan to stop me. Despite my attempt to duck and dodge, she stabbed me in the neck with the needle. Even though her attack was lightning fast, she managed to inject the Temporex directly into my jugular. I was already off balance, trying to duck her attack with the needle, when she slammed into me. I fell hard to the floor. Well, actually, no. I started to fall towards the floor, but the massive dose of the drug injected directly into my neck took effect almost instantaneously. All sound dropped in pitch, then died away entirely, as if the soundtrack of life was a vinyl record that suddenly stopped spinning. The world froze before I hit the ground. In one instant, I was struggling like a madman to get away, and in the next, I was frozen in mid-fall, like a bug fossilized in amber. I was suspended in mid-air. Jessica's lunge into me knocked me into the air. Both my feet had left the floor. I could see Jessica's ankles and left hand at the edge of my vision. The syringe was still stuck in my neck, an annoying, painful pinprick that didn't let up. I assumed it was empty, and Jessica had pushed all 100 cc's of the Temporex into my bloodstream. I waited. Nothing changed. I was still falling at the floor. Jessica's feet were a blurry feature in my peripheral vision. I waited. Nothing changed. I had started screaming when Jessica slammed into me. My chest was still tight. My abdominal muscles were compressing my lungs and pushing air through my vocal cords, but there was no sound, and the pressure in my chest didn't diminish. I was still screaming, but with geological slowness. My view of the floor remained unchanged. I returned to the thought that I was like a bug, fossilized in amber. Fossilized with nothing to look at but the floor. I had plenty of time to think about that word. It implies millions of years. From the perspective of the fossil, that's millions of years of nothing. Nothing but endless waiting in the dirt, or deep inside a sedimentary rock, in unchanging darkness. T-33 experienced 8 million years of consciousness in the subway station. That's a geologically significant amount of time. That's longer than it took for ancient hominids like Lucy to evolve into modern humans. Imagine everything important that has ever happened to the human race. The invention of language, use of fire, the slow development of agriculture, Sumerians, pyramids, the feudal system. Imagine spending all that time in silent darkness. Was that what I was facing? I felt sick with fear and despair. I waited. Nothing changed. I thought about ancient hominids. I thought about all the movies I had seen and the books I had read. I thought about my childhood and about my career. I waited. Nothing changed. How much perceived time had I experienced? 5 hours. A day. Without anything changing except my thoughts. Judging the passage of time. My perceived time, anyway, is hard to do. I was still screaming. Air was slowly moving out of my chest. I had not inhaled for hours in my time frame. I waited. Something changed. The floor was closer. Jessica's feet and hand had shifted slightly relative to each other. This meant I could still perceive the forward motion of time. Perhaps 1/10 of a second had passed since Jessica jabbed me with the syringe. I remembered that I was falling face first, out of control. It sounds funny, but I'd forgotten that I was in midair, reeling from a high-speed, high-energy collision with Jessica. So much time passed in my time frame that my ongoing fight with Jessica was a distant memory. Even though it would take days, a week maybe, in my time frame before I hit the floor, I had to start planning for my landing now. I willed my arms to move upward to protect my head when I slammed into the floor. Then I found ways to pass the time. I wrote poems in my head and memorized them. Then I thought about Temporex. Jessica predosed with the sleeping aid for the drug that caused T33 to have such an extreme drug interaction before I injected her with 40 milligrams of Temporex. According to the Adverse Drug Reaction Bulletin, the extreme mental speed-up that killed T33 was likely caused by the interaction between Temporex and ambient. But I hadn't taken the sleeping aid that caused the cross-reaction. Why was I having a reaction to the drug, like T33 did? Maybe because I got 100 milligrams of it directly to the neck. What did I know about the pharmacokinetics of Temporex? Quite a bit, as I was the principal researcher for the human trials. Because me, Jessica, and T33 had taken different doses in different ways. We had different absorption and distribution rates of Temporex. My extreme reaction could have been due to the enormous dose I received rather than interaction with another drug. What does this mean for the antidote? Will it work for me? Flumazenil is a benzodiazepine antagonist, but is used for the complete or partial reversal of sedative effects caused by benzodiazepines. Temporex certainly isn't a sedative. It does affect the same GABA receptors that flumazenil binds to. My educated guess was that the antidote would work for me. The only problem was, it could take years from my perspective to simply walk to the table with the antidote and inject it. My arms eventually moved upward, like plants slowly growing towards the sun. My arms started in an arms-out pose to push Jessica away from me, and slowly rose to shield my head from the slow-motion fall. The floor was even closer to me now. I was accelerating toward it. The act of moving my arms introduced a twisting motion to my fall, and my view slowly changed from the floor to Jessica. She was falling with me. The way she leapt at me had sent her into a trajectory that eventually sent her to the floor behind me. This complicated motion slowly developed and evolved over hours and days. Jessica's ankles slid into view after I began moving my arms. I tried again to find ways to occupy my mind, so that the days-long wait until I hit the floor would be bearable. I started writing a novel in my head. I eventually saw Jessica's knees. I tried to remember the lyrics to every song I could ever remember hearing. Then the hem of her white lab coat moved into my field of vision. Then finally her face. Her eyes were fixed on me. Was she studying how I moved through the air? Was she planning on optimizing her next moves based on how she predicted I would land? I fell through most of a year. If Jessica hit me in springtime, I spent summer airborne, preparing to hit the ground. When I finally felt my arm gently touch the floor, it was like the first day of autumn. Imagine spending an entire summer staring at one face that was looking back at you. An entire summer trying to imagine what she was thinking. Thinking about what she was going to do next. I was already so tired of thinking every conceivable thing I could think about. I had already dwelt on, over and over again, all over the course of a second in normal time. I practiced meditation, learned how to clear my mind. It made the time pass faster. I landed on my shoulder. Impact began as hardly a noticeable tickle in my upper arm. Then the tingle grew into a gentle pressure. Then a not-so-gentle pressure. Then pain. I tried to adjust my body so that the fall would turn into a roll. But the disconnect between thinking about moving my body and actual muscle movement was too vast. I managed to twist into an even more awkward fall, saving my shoulder at the expense of crushing my face. My cheekbone hit first. Like my shoulder, impact started as a gentle tickle, but as inevitable as the coming of winter and nearly as slowly turned into a pressure and then pain. I imagined an extreme slow-motion video of a boxer taking a punch to the face. In the instant the punch lands, the boxer's face becomes an unrecognizable mess, bouncing and stretching skin and cartilage. It felt like the same thing was happening to my face, but in my sped-up time frame, my face was stuck in a distorted, crushed, and smashed mask for weeks. The skin above my eyes tore in a slow, painful unzippering, and something slowly bent and then snapped in my nose. Pressure on one of my molars simultaneously pushed the tooth into the inside of my cheek and popped it out of my jaw. I winced. What would normally be just a quick blink, I experienced days of darkness. I practiced meditation again. I got good at it. Zen master good. My eyelids finally bounced open, and I was rewarded with a different view. Between Jessica's simultaneous fall away from me and the sudden twist in my neck that my head-first impact created, I found myself looking across the aperture chamber at the far platform. The bloody and bizarre stuff happening on the far platform now seemed like a problem from years past, even though only a few seconds had passed since the test subject died and his son liquefied in front of me. But whatever was going on over there had spurred Jessica to inject me with Temporex. Now, with 100 milligrams of it screaming through my brain, I saw what Jessica saw. There was a hole in the space above the test subject's deathbed. A perfectly round, blue pit was hovering in the air about 3 feet over the bed. It wasn't a trick of perspective or the light in the room. It was a floating hole, a neat, clean cut through our three-dimensional space to somewhere else. I remembered what Jessica typed on the message screen immediately before she injected me. He's taken his second death in the aperture. This floating blue hole in the air must be the aperture she was talking about. There was more, though. Something, a tentacle or a tendril, had reached out of the floating pit and was busy slurping up the goo that the test subject's son had become. I started to scream. Of course, in my hyperfast state, no scream came. Sound would eventually come out of my mouth, seemingly months after my brain had sent the scream and blind terror signal to my lungs and vocal cords. But without the release of hearing a scream, my mind stood in fear and terror for what felt like a long, long time. I eventually managed to mentally talk myself down to a more managed state of fear. I was still scared, but I was able to pay attention to what was happening and able to figure out a way to safety. Looking back, during those long, fearful moments, when I started to realize just how dangerous and evil Jessica's experiments were, I thought whatever would happen to me would happen relatively quickly. I would either soon be killed by whatever was groping its way out of the aperture, or I would dose myself with the antidote and escape, even after being imprisoned in time itself for what I perceived as more than a year. I had no idea the length of the ocean of time that lay before me. To my overdosed mind, my struggle for survival would last longer than a human lifespan. My first impression of the thing that reached out of the aperture was that it was a tentacle. On further study, and I had plenty of time for further study, it looked more insect-like than octopus-like. It had 5 elbow-like joints that I could see from the point of view of my frozen face smash. It looked like it had an exoskeleton or a crab shell. It was dotted here and there with small hairs and pores. A tangled clump of wet-looking, finger-sized bits of blue flesh poked out of the holes in the tip. Each one curled like a dog's tongue, drinking the liquefied cloth that had been a man a few seconds ago. As horrible and strange as it was, I was glad to have something to look at besides the view of the floor. I stared and stared and stared at the far platform. I studied this unchanging scene with the intensity of a homicide detective studying photos of a scene of a long unsolved murder. I noticed that the blue aperture was aligned exactly with the spherical center of the glowing blue light in the circle made by the weird equipment that surrounded the test subject's bed and the platform it was on. The sign on the door to this vast underground space said it was the aperture chamber. Was this equipment here to capture the aperture? Capture it from what? Why did a man need to die at the center of the swirling machinery for the aperture to be captured? The word aperture implies a passage between locations. If this aperture chamber was one end of the aperture, what was on the other side? Until Jessica jabbed me with the huge dose of Temporex, I couldn't see anything other than the liquefying man on the far platform. Why could I only see this with a hyperaccelerated mind? I developed and refined these questions over what felt like months. I searched for answers both in my memory and in the details of the scene. I studied the strange equipment that appeared to have captured the aperture, developing theory after theory about how it worked without any way of determining which, if any, was correct. Eventually, the complicated forces I had set in motion, with my flailing and twisting fall, rotated my bleeding face away from the far platform and back to Jessica. She had already hit the ground by the time I could see her again, and had started pushing herself back to standing. She wasn't staring at me anymore, thankfully. Her eyes were now fixed on the aperture. I drew my knees to my chest and thrust my hands at the floor. I started to perform these motions. I meticulously planned how I would stabilize my fall and bring myself back up to standing. Then I waited for my limbs to cooperate and for gravity and momentum to slowly bounce and slide me across the floor. Occasionally, I would make slight changes to where my hands and foot were going. At one point, I spit out a molar that was knocked loose when I smacked my face. I stabilized myself and rose. I felt my autonomic nervous system switch my breathing from an exhale to an inhale. Everything that had happened since Jessica stabbed me with the syringe had occurred in just one breath. I kept my eyes on Jessica as I rose. Jessica remained fixated on the far platform. Something about her looked different. I waited. I meditated. I designed a mechanical clock in my mind. I meditated more. Jessica's face changed further. She now had a look of fear. She extended her index finger and began to raise her arm. I recognized the gesture, even though she had only just started making it. She was pointing to the far platform. I twisted my neck around to glance at the aperture. Incredibly, my situation had gotten worse. A second long-jointed proboscis had emerged from the hole. This one wasn't aiming for the man puddle on the floor. Whatever was in the aperture was thrusting this second appendage into the chamber and towards us. The second interdimensional death proboscis shot out of the pit and reached into the space in the center of the aperture chamber. Of course, when I say it shot out of the pit, I'm speaking in relative terms. My mind was super-accelerated to the point where a single breath seemed to last for a year or two. The second interdimensional death proboscis moved fast enough that I could perceive minuscule changes in its position after each long meditation session that I engaged in. To the unaccelerated mind, it must be moving lightning fast, like a barracuda or venomous snake making a kill. Jessica was eventually satisfied that I saw what she was pointing at and stopped wasting time getting my attention. Instead, she flung herself toward the keyboard by the machine. I followed her motion, and eventually the banks of the computer monitors rotated into view. Before Jessica dosed me with the drug, the monitors appeared to be flashing nothing but seizure-inducing noise. Under the influence of the mind accelerator, however, I saw that what Jessica said was true. Each screen was being updated with new data 500 times a second. One monitor was displaying the Wikipedia page for Bolivia. The screen next to it was scrolling through some old work of fiction. Tossed the still lighted pipe into the sea. The fire hissed, and the waves in the same instant the ship shot by the bubble the sinking pipe made. The screen below that one showed part of an academic paper full of equations. I couldn't even guess what the subject area was. I can't exaggerate the relief I felt at seeing this random and eclectic set of information on the screens. These computer monitors gave my mind something to do. I read the Bolivia page over and over. I memorized the page of fiction, and I studied the mathematics so thoroughly that I began to understand it. Eventually, the screen displaying the Wikipedia page updated, a slow process where I got to watch the screen slowly redraw itself one row of pixels at a time. This is what a 500 Hz update rate looked like when overdosing on Temporex. Jessica started typing. She could take her time, I thought. As boring as the information on these screens might be under ordinary circumstances, they gave me something to do. The stuff to think about besides, whatever my mind and memories could conjure up on their own. Days later, the first 2 letters of Jessica's message appeared in the word processor window. We need to. She wasn't wasting time typing spaces. The second proboscis had visibly stretched further into the room. I read dozens of Wikipedia pages and about 100 screenfuls of the work of fiction that flew up the screen. It was Moby Dick. I wondered what Jessica was trying to say. We need to what? Eventually, more of Jessica's message showed up. We need to shut it. I guessed what she was communicating. We need to shut it down. Shut what down? The aperture capture machine. I took in more of the information scrolling past on the 500 Hz monitors. After the seeming eternity with nothing to look at, but the floor or Jessica's face, or the horrific stuff unfolding by the aperture. Reading Moby Dick and random Wikipedia pages felt like pure hedonism. Jessica finally finished her message. We need to shut it down. Breakers on distribution cabinets on left and right. Jessica didn't spend time turning around to see if I understood. She jumped off the platform as soon as she finished the message and started running towards the equipment on the right side of the aperture. I made a snap decision, which in my mental state meant that I thought about it over for what seemed like days. Jessica, I guessed, assumed that I would take on the job of turning off the breaker on the left side of the chamber. She just ran off to the right without checking with me. What if I did this? What were the risks from coming close to the interdimensional horror that was thrashing out of it? Would I even recognize the distribution cabinet if I saw it? Would I be able to figure out how to turn off the power there? There was simply no way to think out the answers to these questions. They could only be answered definitively by committing to the course of action. If the answer to any of them was the wrong answer, then things would get even worse for me than they already were. What was the worst case scenario? That the aperture monster would liquefy me, and in my mentally accelerated state, liquefaction would take months, not seconds. That was a pretty bad worst case scenario. Frankly, it was utterly terrifying. But even after mulling over every possible way I could think about the situation, I couldn't come up with a better idea. Staying on the platform and waiting for Jessica to shut off both boxes amounted to spending additional centuries in this room. What if Jessica got killed shutting off the breakers that I was supposed to shut off? I willed my legs to move, to leap off the platform as Jessica had done. The commands to my muscles formed and screamed out of my brain at light speed, only to slam into my glacially slow muscles. I imagined my mind as a Victorian-era woman trapped in a tower, writing a message with a quill pen. My dearest legs, I hope this note finds you well. Please jump off the platform. Then the message was sent by rider and sailing ship to the other side of the world, while I waited for months and months, alone in the tower. From the edge of the platform, I no longer had the view of the computer monitors. I was outside my refuge from boredom, in front of the displays. Instead of reading Wikipedia articles and journals from the world of higher mathematics, I spent the time waiting for my legs to obey by studying the death limb that was climbing out of the aperture and into our universe. The portion of the limb that had emerged from the aperture was dark blue, with 5 elbow-like joints arranged at odd angles. The design of the multiradial elbows appeared to give it the flexibility to bend around complex obstacles. Something about the way it stretched into the center of the room made me think it couldn't see or sense what was there. If there were eyes or other sense organs, they must have been on whatever incomprehensible body lay inside the aperture. I passed the time thinking about what the rest of the creature might look like, and what the environment was wherever it came from that led it to evolve into the man-liquefying monster that was climbing into the aperture chamber. I finally left the platform. I was airborne for months as I leapt 3 feet to the ground. I configured my body well and didn't fall when I hit the ground. It wasn't exactly sticking the landing that earns you a 10 in Olympic gymnastics, but it was good enough. Although I didn't hear it, my landing produced noise. The 5-jointed arm seemed to change its pattern of motion when I landed, and instead lashed out towards me. Did it hear me move? I urged my body to sprint towards the back of the room, to where Jessica said the electrical distribution cabinets were. I moved forward with the speed of grass growing. The arm pushed towards me. All 5 of its elbows straightened at once, launching the human liquefying mop-like end towards me at a speed that would have been faster than perception for a person under normal circumstances. I had plenty of time to think about the best way to dodge its attack. It was clearly much faster than I was. I judged that I might move forward about 2 feet by the time the arm was fully outstretched. I estimated the length of each of its inner elbow segments and guessed that, at full extent, it was going to be long enough to reach me. In other words, I was going to die. If I was right that the extra-dimensional thing that was hunting me was working off the sound of my landing from the jump from the platform, and it couldn't see me well, a big if, then its thrust would probably tend to aim at my landing spot near the floor. If I leapt upward, then the fraction of a second of upwards motion I'd achieved before the arm strike reached me would maximize the distance between me and my landing point. I leapt, then I waited. I suffered through months of terrified waiting to see if I would survive the strike or not. I slowly left the ground, rising many times slower than the moon rising over the horizon. The arm got closer and closer. It was going to be close. What would it feel like, I wondered? Would the process of liquefaction feel like being burned? A rending of tissue? Maybe it would just be a dull numbness. I thought about each of these possibilities, trying to prepare myself for what would happen if the arm hit me. As tense a moment as this was, it still managed to eventually become boring. My life-or-death gamble felt more like a long-term financial investment strategy. Buy and hold stocks, then wait and wait and wait and see if you made the right choice. I meditated. I reminisced about my entire life. I pondered the mystery of the aperture and of Jessica herself. How did she learn about the effects of Temporex overdose and its possible antidote? That's when I realized the interdimensional death proboscis, or whatever it was, wasn't my worst problem. I had so much time to think of the plans, since Jessica typed her instructions to me. Why didn't this occur to me? There was only one dose of the antidote. Whoever made it back to the observation platform first would save themselves. The other doomed to a literal eternity of silent and glacial suffering. I was airborne, moving away from the observation platform and waiting endlessly to see if the death proboscis would hit or miss me. Should I attempt to spin about in midair, risking a catastrophic fall and a most likely lethal interaction with the demon from the pit, just to get ahead, start back to the platform where the antidote sat on the table? What was Jessica doing? Was her typed message about the electrical distribution Rax a ruse to get me to run away so that she could take the antidote without a fight? I turned my head to look beyond the arm of death to the other side of the room. Weeks later, my view finally shifted enough to see Jessica moving behind the aperture machinery. She seemed to still be moving away from the observation platform, toward the back of the room, where the electrical distribution cabinets were supposedly located. I made a major life decision. I decided to trust Jessica. I didn't attempt to change course at all, just maintained a steady all-out sprint toward the back of the room and hope for the best. I eventually landed from my leap. The arm struck the ground 18 inches behind me. I ran toward the machinery in the rear of the room, and the arm didn't follow me. 20 or 30 years after I jumped from the platform, or about 50 feet later, I hazarded a glance backwards. This initial year-long rotation of my head, just to see that the arm was flinging itself toward the other side of the room, toward Jessica. What would happen if Jessica died? Was the electrical distribution system for the aperture equipment dual redundant? If I switched off the equipment on my side, but Jessica didn't reach hers, was this whole effort for nothing? Would I have to try and spend another century running to the other side of a room to shut off the switches on Jessica's side? I ran for years. I mourned my old life, the life from 60 seconds of normal perception time earlier. And I forgot. That's what brains do. Learning and forgetting are just two sides of the same coin. Gaining experience and gaining ignorance are the same biological phenomenon. 5 more steps. Another year. I meditated. I imagined new people and had years-long relationships with them. Another 5 steps. I rounded a concrete footing that held one of the huge shafts that drove the aperture equipment. Then I saw the distribution cabinet, a cabinet bearing a lightning bolt symbol and words in a language I could barely remember. High voltage. It was 40 feet away. Years away. I ran and I prayed. I prayed for the demon arm to return, to emerge from behind the panels, or sneak up behind me and strike me down dead. Finally, there would be no more thoughts, no more oceans of time to suffer across. My prayers were not answered. I kept on living, despite having a career-long amount of time to anticipate arrival at the electrical distribution cabinet. I still misjudged the deceleration required to have a smooth arrival and slammed into the door. I grabbed the handle as I rebounded off the sheet metal and flung it open while steadying myself. 2 banks of 70 amp breakers were mounted in neat vertical rows. At the top, a chunky main power switch with a red handle. I grabbed the handle, an act that took months, and yanked it downward as hard as I could. Nothing happened. Were the power supplies redundant, both needing to be off to turn off the aperture equipment? If so, perhaps I simply got to the left side cabinet before Jessica reached the one on the right side. Or maybe Jessica had been killed by the demon arm before she could power off the racks on her side of the room. Or maybe she had betrayed me and was sneaking back to the observation platform to take the antidote. I invested the time in peeking around the equipment racks to look at the aperture. It was still there, a perfect round cut in space-time. The star in a circle-shaped frame of moving machinery that somehow captured or created the aperture still glowed cherry red. The aperture machinery was still powered on. Both of the dinosaur-sized insect-looking arms still stretched out of the hole in space. One continued to slurp the liquefied man on the platform. The other arm, the one that had attempted to turn me into human juice, was busy with something that was obscured by the machinery. Then something changed. It changed fast, far faster than any phenomenon I'd seen since Jessica injected me. It was the lighting in the room. 24 red emergency lights installed on the ceiling flickered on simultaneously. In my imagination, I heard an emergency klaxon begin wailing too. But my mind was far too sped up for something as slow-moving as sonic energy to produce a noticeable signal. The aperture changed as well. The once sharp edges of the round hole in space were now blurry. I thought it over. Then I thought some more and some more. What else did I have to do? Jessica, I concluded, had shut down the right side power distribution rack. Without power to the equipment, the aperture was closing or destabilizing, or whatever apertures do when their capture machinery powers off. The antidote. I still couldn't see Jessica through the forest of machinery and equipment racks, but I pictured her sprinting mad back to the observation platform to take the one dose of the antidote for herself. I couldn't let that happen. I launched myself back towards the observation platform, pushing off the electrical distribution cabinet for extra acceleration. Jessica had injected me. I knew she had reasons for doing it, but that didn't matter to me anymore. She consigned me to a century of silent imprisonment in this room. I deserved the antidote, not Jessica. I ran for years, only 40 steps back to the observation platform, each one a bottomless well of empty time that I had to fill with my thoughts. I glanced backwards twice. Each tiny gesture slowed me down slightly, causing months of delay. With my first glance backwards, 10 steps away from the power cabinet, I saw essentially the same scene as before. The aperture starting to blur and warp, and the two massive arms still grasping into the room. 32 steps from the power cabinet, 24 feet from the platform, I looked back again. Now both death arms were flailing about. Were they in pain because the aperture was destabilizing? Enraged, still no sign of Jessica, I dove onto the observation platform, laying out horizontally in the air like I was playing ultimate frisbee. I hung in the air for a long time, feeling a little like Superman. Then, like an extremely bored Superman, I eventually landed on my belly and slid from the edge of the platform to the chair in the center. I sprung to my feet and snatched the syringe of Flumesnil from the table. I spun my head around, looking for Jessica. By injecting myself with all the Flumesnil, I was effectively sentencing her to a death as awful as T-33's. Was she going to attack me again to take the drug away from me? I saw her, my decades of worrying and scheming about Jessica taking the antidote were completely misguided. Jessica, still wearing her white lab coat, was by the test subject's platform. scaling one of the pylons of the aperture machine. What the heck was she doing? I grabbed the syringe from the table and immediately injected it into my neck. This process took months. Only seconds of real time passed. But in those seconds, I saw Jessica climb to the business area of the aperture machine, the topmost portion with the red, hot, glowing rails. In one fluid motion, Jessica vaulted herself over one of the rails and into the aperture. She rotated to face me as she fell. Did she see me betraying her, taking the Flumesnil myself? She was too far away for me to read her expression. Jessica slowly fell away into the rift in space, and I pushed the dose into my neck. When Jessica injected the Temporex into my neck, it took effect within a fraction of a second. The antidote, the Flumesnil, also took effect that quickly. But since I was overdosed on the Temporex, the fraction of a second waiting for the Flumesnil to hit seemed like weeks. Time slowly accelerated over those weeks. Jessica's fall into the pit went faster and faster. The edges of the aperture blurred and bent at a frantic pace. The huge five-jointed arm retracted into the pit, eventually moving so quickly that I could perceive their motion like a minute hand on a clock. I heard a soft, low rumble. It sounded like thunder from a storm dozens of miles away. Soon after, the aperture vanished. I didn't know if it finally closed because the aperture equipment was turned off, or if it was still there, invisible to me because my mind was not running fast enough to see it. The thunder sounded again, the sound rising in pitch. I felt my heartbeat for the first time in over a century, a slow squeeze in my chest. I sensed air rushing into my lungs. Then everything was back to normal. The soft, distant thunder was suddenly the deafening sound of a siren blaring. I heard myself gasping in air. I coughed. I screamed. I didn't recognize the sound of my voice. My legs gave out, and I fell to the floor with terrifying speed. Everything moved too fast. There was no time to think about anything. Behind me, the door to the aperture chamber slammed open. I screamed again, startled by the sound, and turned to look at the door. I didn't have to wait to see who was entering. My body immediately obeyed my wishes. A dozen men and women rushed into the room. Security guards holding rifles, as if they might need to start shooting at any instant. People in lab coats holding Geiger counters and other sensors. A crew of paramedics. They moved so fast it was overwhelming. How was I once able to exist at this speed? How can a person process information in a world where everything moves so fast? Half a dozen of them surrounded me, blaring commands to evacuate the chamber, asking questions about my condition. Questions about Jessica. I tried to answer, but could only stumble out fragments of words. I had forgotten how to speak. They rushed me out of the chamber, the room where I had spent the bulk of my century and a half of life. I was basically thrown onto a stretcher and wheeled to a medical facility that was off the same hallway as the aperture chamber. They gave me a bottle of water. I choked on it. I had forgotten how to swallow. They took a blood sample. I heard someone say the words engram decay. Later, they gave me the results of my blood work. My engram decay showed I'd experienced 120 years of consciousness. I was 32 years old when I entered the aperture chamber. My body is still 32, but my mind is 152 years old. Most of my life has been spent in anguish, struggling to survive and escape my torment in that huge underground room. I was in the medical facility for a while. Days, I think. It was like a flash, a blip. I know how to spend a year's worth of time doing nothing other than stare at the floor. Passing the time in the medical facility was no biggie. I recovered my ability to talk and to swallow and to walk. Then they let me go. Someone in a lab coat, one of Jessica's colleagues, escorted me out of the deep basement facility and to the front door of the building. It was so strange, repeating the journey through the offices and lobby that I took over a century earlier. "Good luck," he said, and held the door open for me. I stepped outside. I saw the sky for the first time in 120 years. I heard the wind whistle and felt it blow my hair about. I wept. There were so many cars in the parking lot. Which one was mine? I couldn't remember. I finally found one that looked familiar. It opened with my key, and I sat in the driver's seat. A to-go coffee cup lay on the floor in front of the passenger seat. Was it mine? I didn't remember. I opened the glove box and found the registration. It had my name and my address. Which of these cars was Jessica's? Had she driven to work, expecting to fling herself into another dimension? I couldn't drive. It was too frightening, only having seconds to react to the changing traffic lights and motion of the other vehicles on the road. I walked to the main gate and got them to call a cab. The taxi delivered me to the address on my registration, a vaguely familiar-looking townhouse whose door opened with my key. Recovery is going quickly. Everything is going quickly for me compared to my life in the aperture chamber. The days race by with terrifying speed. I spent a week writing down everything I remember from my long life in the aperture chamber. I'm posting the record of my experiences here. Whatever is going on in that government lab should not be a secret. I know I signed an NDA in Jessica's office, where I agreed not to discuss what I saw and experienced. Frankly, though, I don't care what they're going to do. Put me in jail for a few years for divulging secrets. Believe me, I can do the time easily. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.